Hi, this is Paul. I know I've got a promise to give the Brett and Heather 50th Dark Horse podcast the full commentary treatment, and I still want to do that. I was just listening to it a little bit this morning. It's an hour and 40 minutes, and if I do commentary in an hour and 40 minutes, it'll be almost 3 hours long, probably. And there are segments of it which I'm less interested in than other segments, so I'm trying to figure out how to cut it up. But as I was thinking about it and working on it, I thought about how I wanted to address the Bret Weinstein's metaphorical truth idea. Adam Friended had, in a number of ways, wanted to engage me in conversation with it. And obviously, it's something that we heard about a couple of years ago. And so I've had time to think about it and process it as I've been processing everything else. And I woke up Sunday morning with just a head full of ideas about it and quickly wrote down a bunch of notes. Often when I do that, I have to check those notes later on because you know how you can have a dream and it's like, oh, I see everything. And then you wake up and you look at what you've written down and it's like, I was I was insane, or I wasn't thinking straight, or I was high in my own thoughts. So uh, I often, when we sleep, we sort of process things. And actually, Brett talks about that in one of his conversations about metaphorical truths. But so I wanted to get into that and what it means, what he means by it, what he's trying to build a bridge with it from and to, really between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, why it's very modernistic, which is part of sort of what's going away about it, why it's insufficient, which is why it's going away, and sort of how to move beyond it. And I thought that was really important because his understanding of metaphorical truth very much shapes his take on what he calls religion. And again, we have religion S and religion W. Religion W is pretty much the communal, symbolic, dramatical, liturgical, imaginary, this operating system that we use to compete and cooperate and things that human beings use within a culture. It's the culture net. Religion S is sort of the Enlightenment idea of religion, that it's this thing has to do with the supernatural and gods and rituals and praying and all those types of things. So obviously, this is what I've been talking about a lot in my videos lately. And, if you've been following my channel for a while, you've noticed a pattern. This morning, I also watched Kanye West's interview with Joe Rogan, and then I watched Scott Adams' take on that interview, and I found that enormously interesting. And so I haven't done a lot of little clips yet on my clip channel, and a number of people have commented on my clip channel that if I just start doing just clips as they are, the DMCA and YouTube, yada, 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 yada. And so I was sort of thinking, I've had so much material I've wanted to get out recently. I was sort of thinking that I might do sort of shorter take commentaries on little soundbite things, like on the Scott Adams video on the clip channel. My challenge is always that once I get in front of the mic and start playing a video and start talking, it becomes an hour too long. So I'm still thinking about what to do with that. That clip channel is called Vanderclips with a K. And I made that channel because there were a bunch of little things that I wanted from my own channel and from other channels to sort of isolate and to play with. And so I might do something on Scott Adams there. I'll try and figure out how to do that, because part of the way YouTube works is because this channel has what it has, which is about 15,000 subscribers. A certain number of people will get notified of things. And if I put stuff in the clip channel, which only has about 250 subscribers, because there's not a lot there, most of you won't get noticed or won't get notifications. So I'm trying to figure out how to work YouTube in this algorithm. And I've been fairly active on Twitter over the last couple of years, and I tend to post things there too. So yeah, so that's sort of what's going on. Now, Jordan Peterson begins Maps of Meaning with sort of a fork in the road observation. You can imagine the world as a world of objects, or you can imagine it as a form for action. And Peterson often sees himself within the tradition of the American pragmatists with respect to the form for action. But I think part of why Jordan Peterson has been prescient and helpful moving forward is because some of these insights of the American pragmatists, but also beyond them, come through his Forum for Action. And I think we're probably going to go beyond that a little bit too in this video. So 2 ways to approach the world. A world of objects. A world of objects, if you think about it, it's very, and when I say objectivistic, objectivism, Ayn Rand comes in, and I'm not at all thinking about that. I've never read a whole book of Ayn Rand's. They're really fat. I know a little bit about her, but just the portrayal of that imagines that we see things as they are. The world is a bunch of, back in my videos, like these little Amazon boxes or discrete facts. It's very static. It's very, it imagines again that a camera can see, when a camera can't see anything, because just like my eyeballs can't see, if you pluck an eyeball out of my head and run it around, and I can see over the crowd by plucking my eyeball. No, my eyeball can't see anything. The eyeball is not only attached to my brain and the rest of my body, but as Jordan Peterson, I think, nicely laid out to Sam Harris, whether or not he understood it in Vancouver 1, that eyeball is in some ways attached to my ancestors, because there's an entire structure behind it that allows my eyeballs to see. And I think, as Bret Weinstein and David Sloan Wilson have noted, that eyeball is attached to thousands and thousands and thousands of years of living beings. It's attached to my ancestors. And I only see the world as I do because of the genetic material I inherited from my parents, but also the culture net, that other layer that commingles and co-generates with everything. And that's some of what Jordan Peterson, the key, really, okay, I've been thinking again about doing some more writing, and I might start writing some little self-published books on Amazon where I take a bunch of my thoughts. Now, because I've been doing this for 3 years, I think some things are settled enough in my mind that I'm willing to put them on paper rather than just putting them on YouTube, because YouTube these are my rough drafts. So where was I going with that? So when Jordan Peterson talks about, and with Susan Blackmore, talks about how the genetics and the culture net aren't discrete. That's basically what he says to Susan Blackmore. They're not discrete, that they get into each other. When I first started getting interested in Jordan Peterson, I was thinking a lot about the world that my church members live in, which is a world of science where there's the sun and the moon and the stars, and we're on a globe, and that whole world, versus, let's say, this world of Genesis 1, where we're sort of on a tabletop, and there's waters above and below, and there's the heavens. And I was thinking about those two worlds. I was, again, continuing to read C.S. Lewis's Miracles, where C.S. Lewis talks about the ascension. How do we understand the ascension when we imagine ourselves living on a globe? And C.S. Lewis thought about these ideas a lot, and that really comes through clearly in his book, The Discarded Image. So one of the things that I so intuitively, and again, my right brain was sort of chewing on this, and my left brain, it's taken a while for my left brain to systematize it and get it down, and perhaps that's the way to understand my video monologues, versus, let's say, if I finally get to writing something concrete, which I'm nervous about given my experience with John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastro-Pietro's book, and y'all will see that come out when it comes out. Because really, when you write something, and Peterson says this often, when you write something, it's already digested, because putting it to paper and putting it down in paper it's concretized in a way that, even though my videos are recorded and replayable, it's concretized in a way that the videos don't feel concretized, okay? So this world of objects is this concrete world where we imagine that, well, there's just all these things, and I'm this thing, and we're just all these things. And that's where you talk about truth and facts, and it imagines a very static world in which there's just basically objects, and they're not even in time, and we see them directly, and their identity is knowable. And again, if you work on, John Vervaeke's work has been so helpful. It's not, 50 episodes of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and John sort of has his own language. And once you get deep enough into his language, you can begin to see the real value of the work. But it's not as accessible and easy as some of Jordan's stuff. And so, but I've benefited greatly from John's work. So, this world of objects is just kind of static out there, timeless, and I am not that thing. I am not static. Last week I had a tooth removed from my mouth, and I'm still feeling it. And over the course of this week or so, I've been thinking about, what this means. My sister, my one remaining sister, who has her own YouTube channel. She does videos about decor. She's an artist, and she just last week had, I don't have a problem saying this here because she says it on her channel all the time. If you think I'm high in openness, I'm not anywhere near as high in openness as my sister. But she's an artist and a photographer and a musician, and she suffers from what Jordan Peterson describes. People who are high in openness have difficulty monetizing that's my sister. So she's got her own YouTube channel, but there's a growth on her pituitary. And so last week she had surgery, and they go up through the nose and they go in through the skull there, and they took off this growth around her pituitary, and she's recovering. How did I get here? Okay. I am not the same object I was 2 weeks ago. My sister is not the same object she was 2 weeks ago. We live in a very dynamic place. And when we talk about objects, get back to the Vervaekean stuff, we use labels for objects. And those labels, if they're going to be helpful and durable, those labels relate to the essence of something. And as Vervaeke nicely laid out, the essence of something is not something in and of itself, but that thing in relation to other things. So label me father to my children, label me husband to my wife, label me pastor to my church, label me citizen in the United States in the political realm. So you have this agent-arena relationship that Vervaeke nicely lays out. And so this world of objects is very low resolution, it's very static, and it breaks down. But all of this other language about truth and facts and the way that we use the language now is baked into that world. And that's part of why this is sort of going away. And so when Jordan Peterson comes up with a form for action, it doesn't mean that there aren't objects, but in a sense they sort of recede and they become more dynamic. And what's different between a world of objects and a form for action is very much time and agency and a conscious actor. And so, as we've talked about, again, I was just this morning, my little drive I went to the bank between here and work. In my little drive to the bank, I was listening to Will Durant on Rousseau and listening to some of his treatment of Emile, one of Rousseau's books, and thinking again about how so much of our contemporary world is a product of the 18th century philosophers. And these ideas, the Protestant Reformation was a big pivot, but the Enlightenment was a huge pivot to this world. But so many of those ideas of the philosophers are now in decline. And I think, again, Dr. Jim from Idaho, part of what he recognized is that part of the reason Sam Harris, Bret Weinstein, Jordan Peterson arose when they did, James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, all these individuals, is because their world is disappearing. And sort of like the late 19th, early 20th century conservative Christians arose to fight the modernists, well, these individuals are arising to challenge the postmodernists. And again, those are the labels we use. But there's a fair amount of postmodernity in all of these individuals, and I know that always really bothers um, that always really bothers some of you in the comment section. But I think it's true, and the American pragmatists, I think, in that way, really moved the ball forward in the 19th and early 20th century. And I think Peterson gets that right. And you notice the long delay with these things. These things move very slowly. We as a group deal with these very big questions very slowly, and it takes a good amount of time. And so Peterson really benefits from the American pragmatists and says, hey, that this is moving us forward. And so when you look at the critique of, let's say, Thomas Nagel, the problem that we have is we have to reintegrate time better. The Enlightenment, sort of some of these Enlightenment ideas sort of excluded time. And again, that's a real powerful thing to do because you're eliminating variables and you're trying to, if you've got an agent-arena relationship, even let's say oxygen. Oxygen means different things based on the agent-arena relationship. Oxygen against copper or iron brings rust. Oxygen in the context of scuba diving means life. And so, what is the essence of oxygen? Well, the essence of oxygen in some ways is dependent on the arena. And so you have this agent-arena relationship. And so what science does and why it's so powerful is it gets very granular down into these distinct processes and says, well, okay, electricity plus water makes hydrogen and oxygen. That's really cool. Now, when is that relevant? Well, it could be relevant if you're trying to produce hydrogen cars to put less CO2 into the atmosphere. There's a lot of things that it can that are relevant to it. But and this is where, again, a form for action really moves us forward. Now, the Bret Weinstein did a podcast with Sam Harris, and I thought it was well worth listening to, but also extremely frustrating listening to. And I begin to notice a pattern. Jordan Peterson tries to have a productive conversation with Sam Harris, and it gets frustrating. And Bret Weinstein tries to have a productive conversation with Sam Harris, and it gets frustrating. And a lot of this has to do with, I think, the inconsistencies at the heart of Sam's position. They keep getting stuck because Sam basically holds these two ideas as such. And when he talks, he keeps flipping between them. Okay, so in the past, I've talked about the manifest image and the scientific image. Sam doesn't seem to understand that there's a nose between his eyes, and he never sees out of both eyes. And in many ways, Bret in that podcast pleads with him to see out of both eyes and to try and put these two visions together. And Sam just keeps saying, no, I already have. We don't have to do this. Well, if you have, you certainly aren't explaining it to us. Well, you keep getting stuck because on one hand, we have this deterministic scientific view, scientific image of the world that we are not agents, we have no freedom, everything is determined. And J.P. Marceau just sent a tweet this morning. He wrote a really good article on reading C.S. Lewis's Miracles and integrating it with some of Vervaeke's ideas. I thought it was really excellent. And there's a video that goes along with it, and I'll probably forget to put it in the notes for this show, but if I do forget, leave a comment, and hopefully if I don't see it, someone else will see it. But that was a well worth video. I didn't see the video, I read the article, which is, again, part of the reason that I'm thinking I really have to figure out a way to do more writing. Anyway, part of the reason Bret and Sam kept getting stuck was you have these two visions. One is that we're not agents, we have no freedom, everything is determined. And very much looks like C.S. Lewis's Miracles, the whole show. And on the other hand, when we watch the movie, you can have feelings of purpose and illusion of meaning and agency, and even if we don't really have it. And for most people, that's simply not satisfying. And it always gets buffered by the usual, well, he writes about meditation and he has a meditation app. Oh, okay. But it's really the difference between, let's say you have a son and he spends all of his time on computer games, and he says, I'm perfectly happy and I intend to be in this chair and play computer games until my biological functions cease. And maybe, we were talking at our meetup last night, maybe a universal basic income is the cheapest way to deal with unproductive people. And so we're just going to make sure that they all have virtual reality and computer games and a good internet connection, and they can all live in basements and spend all of their days playing computer games. And who cares if their lifespan is only 30 or 40 years, because biologically it's not a very healthy way to live, and who cares if they don't actually produce anything or get anything done, as long as they're happy. They're watching the movie, they're playing the computer game, they're acting as if they are agents in a world when they're really, and we look at that and we say, that's not how a human being should be. Well, maybe that's an illusion, this moral image of going down in the basement and seeing our children. Now, again, we don't have basements in California. Going into our children's bedroom and watching them play computer games all the time and saying, I want better for you. No, there is no better for me. I'm just watching. And so we keep getting stuck here. And so this really is where we get going with the metaphorical truth business. And there are a number of videos out there, a number of times when Bret gets into this. And so I'm going to play a few of them. One of them was this is a little clip from Joe Rogan Experience with Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and Bret Weinstein on the nature of truth.
That. So we're treading kind of close to the argument you got into with Sam Harris about the nature of truth. And since I heard that, I've been sort of itching to have this conversation with you, because I think there's a way of viewing this that will actually perhaps reconcile the 2 points of view, but there's a bitter pill that comes along with it. So here's my argument. We tend to think of intellect as having evolved because knowing what's true gives you an advantage. But there's actually nothing that says...
Okay, knowing what's true. What do you mean by that? Is there a lion in the bush? Objects. Knowing what's true. Again, almost always when we hear about these truth conversations, it's almost always correspondence between a mental map and a world of objects. All right? Pay attention to that as we go through this conversation.
As the literal truth is where advantage lies. And so...
Okay, literal truth. That there's a lion in the bush that if I could, and we see this in movies, if I could stop time... See, but now pay attention. I'm not really stopping time. It's like I'm stopping time out there in the world. I'm freezing it, and then I'm walking over, and there's the lion, and I can touch it. And, well, if I stop time, it's not really breathing, but maybe it's still warm, and I feel its fur, and and now what's the relevant aspect of lionness with respect to that picture? It's that the lion can eat me, okay? And... Of course, celebrity atheists for a long time have talked about hyperactive agency detectors, where we're always anxious about the lion, and that has an evolutionary adaptation. It keeps us alive, but what that means is that we're worried, ancient people were worried that there are these other agents out there in the world that are moving the world, and that's what sort of creates the world around us.
I have a category that I call literally false, metaphorically true. These are ideas that aren't true in the factual sense, but they are true enough that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you would be if you behaved according to the fact that they're not true. So let me give...
Okay, now pay attention to, these are ideas. Are they really ideas? Because as we dig into this, a lot of these are not so much ideas. Now, again, think about Vervaeke's 4 types of knowledge, the 4 Ps. Propositional. There's a lion in the bush. Lion is a proposition. There is a lion in that bush. Okay. Perspectival. What's my perspective about the lion? Well, I'm here and the lion's there. So it's very much spatial. Participatory. Well, I can get my gun and shoot the lion. Procedural. Well, I'm a stupid American on safari in Africa, and I don't know anything about lions, but the Africans that are with me have, for thousands of years, lived in a context with lions, and very much will say, okay, do this, do this, do this, do this. Those are all forms of knowledge. And those forms of knowledge are not facts. They're knowledge. And so often when we get into this conversation, we're just talking about the propositional. And this is so deeply ironic because it's all the propositional stuff that people complain about with respect to church. I just can't handle the dogma. Oh, okay. But I like the music, and you like the procedural, the participatory. You like those things, but you don't like the propositional. And that's just it. It's a conflict between the propositionals. And when you get to the celebrity atheist or someone who, what is an atheist? And again, the Distributors just did a really nice video on this. What is an atheist? Well, an atheist is someone who says propositionally there is no super thing. And so procedurally, perspectively, participatorially, I don't have to relate to this super thing because it isn't there, but there's a lion in the bush. And so this is where, now it's in this phase that we get into the metaphorical truth, because Bret is trying to really adjust for at least perspectival and participatory, and he's using this metaphorical truth idea. But part of the reason I think he's getting into this is, and we're going to, it's very, the choice of the word metaphorical in this is very telling. Okay? We'll keep going.
Give you a couple of trivial examples that won't be controversial. Porcupines can throw their quills. It's not true. However, if you live near porcupines and...
Now, there's a little book that I ordered because I ran across a quote. This talks about, it's an anthropological book. And it talks about common sense as a cultural system. Porcupines can throw their quills. Not true. Porcupines, well, what do I mean they can throw their quills? They can launch them. No, you got to touch them. They got little barbs on them. If you watch Alone, they've been eating porcupines. It's one of the few animals that they can eat up there in this Arctic region that they drop these strangest game show participants into. And so, untrue. Now, how about try something like this? A stitch in time saves 9. Is that true? But it's not talking about a world of objects. Well, there are objects involved. It's procedural. Is a stitch in time saves 9 always true? No. In what world is a stitch in time saves 9 active? Well, how many different objects? Well, certain objects like clothing, that's where the metaphor is coming from. A stitch in time saves 9 stitches. Because if you don't address a little tear, it can become a big tear. Sometimes it's not true. Sometimes it is true. It's there living in a world of objects. It's also living in time. And you would very much say that a stitch in time saves 9 is much more of a form for action. And even this, a porcupine can throw its quills, that's much more living in a form for action than a world of objects. Because, okay, you see right there the difference between those worlds, this metaphorical truth, it's trying to break out of this world of objects. It's trying to break out of it, but it's really hesitant, and it's a little bit scared, and we're going to use the truth word because we kind of we know that we're going to have, truth has to do more freight than just propositional truth, the 1P. It's got to do more freight because there's procedural truth, participatory truth, but suddenly we're getting into the question of what is truth. And again, Jordan Peterson very famously said things like, well, your aim is true. Well, what does that mean? Well, it kind of has correspondence. Or how about your spouse is true? Now, if you haven't listened to my conversation with Joe, where I think I named it deconstruction and a bunch of other things. I don't remember what I named it. We get into that because, okay, what does it mean to be a true son? Is there a biological connection? Okay. But there's a much bigger world in which there's loyalty to the father. There's obedience of the father. And you might say, well, he might not have been his biological son. See, the relevance realization, the agent-arena relationship between that even the word son has. He might not have been his biological son, but he was his true son. And what you're doing is you're looking at an essence of the Father and finding that in the Son, and you are looking for correspondence, but it's not in a world of objects. There are objects in the world, but that's not where it is.
And you imagine that porcupines can throw their quills, you'll give them some space. If you don't, you may, realizing that they can't throw their quills, get really close to one, and it may wheel around and nail you with a porcupine quill, which can be extremely dangerous because...
Okay, now we're talking about wisdom, and actually a little bit later in this clip, which I'm not going to go that far, Joe Rogan is going to talk about wisdom. Well, how do wisdom and knowledge relate? Well, knowledge is a little bit more staticky, and wisdom is a little bit more over time. And so knowledge might say, a porcupine doesn't throw its quills. Wisdom says, yeah, but they can move quick and they can be erratic, and you're not always so good on your feet, and something might happen, and the consequence, that the payoff of getting so close to the porcupine, which is why you want to get close, might not outweigh the liability if you get a quill stuck in your hand and all of the trauma and possibility of infection and all of that kind of stuff you're going to have to deal with. And so wisdom comes into the picture here.
They are microscopically designed to move in from where they puncture you over time, and they can puncture a vital organ, or you can get an infection. So the person who believes that a porcupine can throw their quills has an advantage that isn't predicated on the fact that this is actually a literal truth, right?
Okay, what does he mean by literal there? See, it's not entirely easy to say. Well, in this physical world of objects, there's these little knowledge chunks. True or false? Porcupines can throw. Well, what is throw? They take their little paw and they go, whoom? No. Well, they fling, or they... See, metaphor is built into this thing all the way through. And we're just so good at dealing with it, we don't even pay attention to it. And so, literally true. So question and answer, porcupine can throw its quills, false. Okay, that's what you mean by literal? It's sort of what he means by literal.
Another one might be, people say everything happens for a reason, right? Well, unless you're talking about physics as the reason, everything doesn't happen for a reason. However...
Okay. Right there. Presupposition. Assumption. Can Bret know whether or not everything happens for a reason? What do we mean by a reason? What we think is that, well, now we're suddenly in a religious realm where there's consciousness somewhere in relation to us. It's an agent arena relationship. Okay, everything happens for a reason. That's an agent arena relationship. He says, no, it doesn't. How do you know? How can you know? Is that is that falsifiable? Can you verify it? It doesn't mean it's a good reason. It doesn't mean it's a knowable reason. The fact is, our knowledge is about this big. And so, now, when people make claims such as, well, everything happens for a reason, so Katrina hit New Orleans because of the immoral behavior of people who lived in New Orleans. Is that the reason for the hurricane? Is that the reason for the hurricane, or were there atmospheric reasons? Or, so very quickly we're getting into, well, what causes this? And he says, well, unless there's physics, okay. But in many ways, we're back into Aristotle here, because there are multiple causes. Well, which cause was this? And, but again, his assertion, he just slid it right in there. There isn't. Well, how do you know? That's an assertion. It's not a fact. It's nothing that you can actually you state it as a proposition. What it is a belief of yours, but you just slide it right in there. And, nobody pays any attention to it because, pay attention over here about the quills and everything happens for a reason. And all the other things our brain is paying attention to, we just slide it right in there. Okay. But it's not true. It's just an assertion.
However, if you are the kind of person who believes that everything happens for a reason, and then some terrible tragedy befalls you, you may be on the lookout. Well, what's the reason that this happened? Maybe it's supposed to open some opportunity, and you won't miss that opportunity the way somebody who was preoccupied with their misfortune would. So, literal falseness.
Okay. So he says, well, maybe believing that everything happens for a reason is an advantage, is adaptive to us. Maybe we'll do better if we believe that. Maybe people who believe that outperform. What do we mean by perform? They outlive people who just say everything is random. And you go into your doctor says, well, you have lung cancer. Well, everything happens for a reason. And the doctor says, yeah, you smoked 3 packs a day for your whole life. That's why you have lung cancer. Oh, no, the reason I was thinking is that, okay, how many reasons are there for this person's lung cancer? Their genetics, that they smoke 3 packs a day, that, other people out there smoking, their age. There are multiple reasons, and the reasons don't all act equally, and the reasons also don't all work in the same level of knowledge. Are there propositional reasons? Are there perspectival reasons? Are there participatory reasons? Are there procedural reasons? It's an agent-arena relationship. What's the essence of the situation? Now, so that's why he's going to say, well, there's metaphorical truth. Well, he's saying things don't happen for a reason. Well, that seems totally wrong. I would say that things happen for lots of reasons. The question that we're asking is much more of a relevance realization question. Which reason is key? It's sort of like we're having this grand experiment in COVID deaths. Well, COVID doesn't really kill people. Okay, but we've got a bump in number of people, and just raising this issue will get the comments, so go ahead, have at it. It's fine. But certain number of more people on average are dying. You want to know what causes death? Old age. And it's not the reason that a lot of people pay attention to. They died of, we say natural causes. It should just say they died of old age. Their body wore out. And you might say, well, that's, bias. People of age are dying at way higher rates than young people of COVID, and therefore that's systemic injustice. Because people don't choose their age, they receive their age. And so, we should move heaven and earth so that people don't die of old age. Oh, okay. Which reason? And metaphorical truth, well, he's trying to patch something here. Because he says, well, this is truth. Truth is you can produce hydrogen and oxygen out of water with electrolysis. That's truth. But you have lung cancer. That's a much more complex truth. Now, a long and a short of it in terms of relevance realization is don't start smoking when you're 16 so that you're still not smoking when you're 55 so that you have lung cancer. Well, that's a reason. Or maybe another reason is don't be born to, oh, no, can't do that because you don't choose your parents. On and on and on and on and on and on and on. And what we're doing with these conversations is we're trying to whittle them down to certain things. And so, okay, don't get COVID. Because if you get COVID and you smoke and you're old and you're overweight, well, which reason is it? There's lots of them.
But metaphorical truth is actually, I would argue, the category under which religious truth evolves.
Okay. The category under which religious truth evolves. Okay, what do you mean by religion here? I would assert he means religion S. Okay, not religion W, worldview. Religion S. That, and so he's got this categorical truth. Okay, or this metaphorical truth. All right. And again, he's trying to patch something here because, and when we play a clip with him and Peterson, again, he's sort of in the middle there, and we'll hear his both the value and objection to this metaphorical truth.
Now, the problem, the bitter pill that I mentioned, is that I've heard you say that the truths that are captured in the religious version of things are basically...
Okay, religion S, all of this Bible stuff, all of these old writings. Now, what's interesting is, are Plato's writings religious? Depends what your religion is, right? If you're a Neoplatonist, yeah, they're really religious. Are Aristotle's writings religious? Are Rousseau's writings religious? Are Voltaire's writings religious? Are Newton's writings religious? Are Darwin's writings religious? Okay, now we've got this relevance realization issue with respect to religion. And as we'll see, I mean, what he's responding to in terms of Peterson's work is Peterson has said that over long periods of time, human beings have been writing stuff down about how they see the world, and there are valuable things encoded in those writings that should be taken into account in terms of how we see the world today, because actually they deeply shape how we see the world today, and it has value. And so in many ways, what Jordan and Bret are trying to do, and Sam too, when the three of them together are trying to say, okay, how can we assess this value? Okay, value when, where, why, and so it'll be in the details. But now, sticking in the middle of this, and again, this is relevance for, and again, it's so left over. Again, if you read Voltaire, if you read Rousseau, if you read what's going on in the 18th century in France, all throughout Europe, really. If you read the philosophers, if you read all them, it's the same conversation they're having. They're just saying, okay, well, now we've got this new class of ideas that we are categorizing as religious. Okay. And what are we going to do with them?
Like the religious version of things are basically like, there's an individual truth, and then there's a truth of your family, and there's a truth of the population that you're living in, and these things are all encoded in these doctrines, which is true, and you would expect it to be because the doctrines are carried along in the population. The problem is, what I hear you...
And it's really interesting. If you go back, and these are true. Okay. How are they true? Are they propositional true? See, right there, already, it's really hard to not let all of this language stuff just bleed all over the place. They're true. That's absolutely valid use of the word true. Are they literally true? Well, wow, now we have the word literally. Well, what do you mean? Well, which one? Man plus woman and intercourse equal baby. Is that literally true? What do you mean by that? Well, there's a biological layer that's happening at. There's a societal layer that's happening at. Again, there's what layer? The world is too big for us to really process easily.
Are these doctrines, which is true, and you would expect it to be because the doctrines are carried along in the population. The problem is, what I hear you arguing, and you tell me if I have it wrong, is that we should therefore expect the encoded metaphorical truths in these religious traditions to be...
Okay. Why did he slide in metaphorical truth there? Well, because these religious traditions, they're relating to this character, Yahweh, or Marduk, or they're relating to dead people, ancestors. They're relating to, well, that's not literally true. Okay, what do you mean it's not literally true? Well, there are no super things that you can relate to. Okay, do you know that? You're asserting that. You don't know. You don't know. And when you're asking, okay, well, what kind of thing is this God of the Hebrews? Well, what kind of thing is that God of the Hebrews? What do they say? Kind of thing that God? Well, it's something that you can relate to, and it will impact what goes on in your life. Well, that seems to be the most obvious thing. It's certainly impacting what goes. No. I mean, like miracles will happen and stuff. Oh, okay. Well, what are those? So, I mean, and what we're trying to do is shorthand this. But again, this is so totally a conversation of the 18th century.
Morally metaphor is that we should therefore expect the encoded metaphorical truths in these religious traditions to be morally right.
Okay, what do you mean by moral? Okay, the world is too big for us to process. So we have all these little tricks and hacks and shorthands. Well, morality. Well, what is morality? Well, it's usually whole groups of people watching each other and saying, we're going to celebrate that and we're going to punish that. And so we're going to celebrate that and punish that. So there's morality. Okay. These are morally right. So what are you saying? It's saying, well, these documents they have a lot of moral assertions in them, some of which we continue to buy. I've been preaching a sermon series on the Ten Commandments, and especially as the Protestant reformer said, the second table of the law, it's not terribly controversial. Honor your father and mother. Do you have a responsibility to take care of aged parents? Well, yeah, kind of. And if you ignore or neglect your parents and they're out there begging on the street and your neighbors come by and say, hey, isn't that your dad there at the corner panhandling at the light? Yeah. Don't you live in that beautiful home and drive those nice cars and make all that money? Yeah. Shouldn't you take your father in and care for him? It's not terribly controversial. You shall not murder. Well, that's about one of the most universal ones. You shall not steal. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not lie in court against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. We're like, well, that's not so bad. Well, how far are you going to take the coveting? Are you gonna let that ruin your own marriage? Because, every day your wife sees you oogling at the neighbor's wife, and, or every day your husband hears you pining for your neighbor's house. Why can't you give me a house like that? It's not bad advice, but morally. And so what Bret is saying, well, you cannot take moral assertions from there. Well, where are you getting your moral assertions from? Is there a new book, or are those books actually in a long history of conversations with each other where we're tinkering with these things? For example, in the Ten Commandments, you're not allowed to covet your neighbor's manservant or maidservant. So what does that mean? Your neighbor's slaves. Are you allowed to covet your neighbor's slaves? Well, my neighbor doesn't have any slaves. Well, why not? Because these things have been in a long history all the way through. But Bret is saying, well, you can't take morality from it. Really? Which morality? Well, it said, no, you can take some morality from it. Okay. Well, how do we know which morality to take from it? To say this is good and this is bad? Well, we don't think a lot about that, do we? Because, again, Christian Smith, sociologist, massive study of American youth in the 90s. How do you know right and wrong? I get it from my parents. How do you know it is right and wrong? I just know. That's American culture. Is Bret Weinstein American? Yes. Is he American culture? Yes. He's about my age, so grew up more in the 80s. Did we kind of think that way in the 80s? Yes. So, but now, there's this religion in the Bible, and now he's going to have a reason why. Don't take it at face value. But again, I keep arguing that, and actually gets pointed out in the conversations with Sam Harris. The Bible, I assert that there's a critique of slavery in the Bible. There's a critique of a lot of things. In the book of Genesis, there's a critique of primogeniture, of giving the oldest a double inheritance at the expense of the other children. We don't do that today. I'm going to split my estate up equally amongst my children, unless someone pisses me off, and then I'm giving it all, and I'm going to spite them all. Not that there'll be any grand estate from Paul Vanderklay left for the children. I had 5 of them, so not expecting much from my mom. Mom, just have enough to live the way you want to in your retirement years. It's okay by me. But where do we get our ideas about right and wrong? This is right and this is wrong. Well, you don't find Christians continuing to own slaves in North America today. You can find other slave-holding societies in the world, and then you can twiddle with the definition of slavery. So this idea and this argument isn't really very good, but let's hear it out because it's coming to an important point.
But there's nothing that actually says it will be morally right. Moral, metaphorical truths in these religious traditions to be morally right. But there's nothing that actually says it will be morally right. Because
actually says it will be morally right. Well, tell me how you figure out if something is morally right or not. Isn't that the entire conversation that Peterson is trying to have with respect to all of this? Well, morally right, and Bret's doing a lot of podcasts on it now, morally right is that which perpetuates his idea of of how human beings should live in their little time in the world, and they'd be more happy than sad. And sometimes every now and then on Twitter, someone will come out with something, and I'll ask him, I said, well, the maximum amount of happiness for most people. Okay, well, how about, so happy is, okay, put them in, give them lots of video games and Cheetos and porn and, maybe they're deliriously happy for 30 years and, they won't live very long, but, really, what's the difference between living 30 years and living 80 years or living 100 years? And then, of course, Jordan Peterson says, yeah, with respect to time, just give them cocaine. Bang! Maximum happiness done. Put them on drugs. Peterson's digging at deeper issues and, morally, it's all these assumptions about morality, and there's nothing that says it's right. Is there a book out there that you're comparing the Bible to? Or do you have a fair amount of ideas of various magnitude and certainty that you are comparing the Bible to? Ideas from today compared to what you can read in that Bible then. Even though you look around at, say, a Christian like myself and, and probably 99.9, if we were to sit down if you asked Bret Weinstein and I to sit down for 2 hours and write down as many moral beliefs as we could think of, we might have 85, 87, 88% agreement on the list that we write down. Or if you were to ask us, yep. High amount of agreeability. I say, there is a God. He says, there is no God. All right, well, does that really make any difference? If so, how? Well, you should go to church on Sunday. That's moral to do, I would say. And he'd say, no, okay, there's one that we don't agree on. You should not want your neighbor's wife to the degree that it makes your wife want to stick a knife in your chest when you're dead. Yep. He loves his wife. I love my wife. I love watching him with his wife on the show. They're just a delightful couple to watch. And so I think he actually, like a Christian who says you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, he mentally, I'm sure that there's been plenty of other women that he's met in his life that were attractive, and he could have pursued conversations, experiences, trips, events, yada, 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 that would have put him on a path towards pursuing a romantic relationship with them instead of his wife. And he at some point said, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, why not? I'm not going to covet that other person. I'm going to stay true to my wife. Yep. And we say, good, Bret. That's moral. Where's the book you read that in? Well, it came to me through my parents. Yeah, it came to you through your parents. Your parents are reading the same book. Now, if you've watched podcast 50, you know where some of this is going.
Because there are metaphorical truths that might, in fact, be reprehensible, but nonetheless effective.
Oh, metaphorical truths that are reprehensible, but nevertheless effective. And see, it's really cool because he's been watching Jordan and now he puts an eye over to Joe Rogan. And this is my big point. This is the gotcha, that there are metaphorical truths that are effective for what? But nevertheless reprehensible with whom? Effective for what? Because, well, like, I don't know, firebombing Dresden. Effective, reprehensible. Well, this is always where we have our most interesting moral conversations, isn't it? Should we have firebombed Dresden? Effective, reprehensible. But what's really interesting is that when you listen to these conversations, especially with Sam Harris, Sam keeps wanting to argue well-being is most of the time somehow self-evident. Oh, and well, I should really buy a copy of Dominion so I can hold it up, because this whole morality thing, isn't this all about effective, but then also sometimes reprehensible? And what happens when there's conflict over that?
And it might, but there's nothing that actually says it will be morally right.
As if there's this book of morality that's out there. Oh, it's the Bible. Oh, it's not the Bible.
Because there are metaphorical truths that might, in fact, be reprehensible, but nonetheless effective. And so what I would argue, the overarching point here would be that you're right, that the documents that contain these descriptions of things are full of things that are true in some sense that is not.
We've got senses of truth. We're making progress.
Literal scientific truth, nor was
scientific truth. Ooh, we've got more adjectives. We're making more progress.
That their purpose.
Their purpose. Oh, truths can have purposes attached to them. We're making a lot of progress here.
What isn't true is that.
Which way did you use the word there?
Those things, their purpose. What isn't true is that those things are inherently up to date.
Well, yeah. That's why your neighbors who are Christians, that's why Paul Vanderklay doesn't own any slaves. So what's the value of that book? Well, you can't just read the book as such. I don't know any Christians who do. Now, some of the Christians are a little naive about that, but there's lots of naivete around the world.
First of all, the first thing about that is that a discussion like that, and this is also what happened with Sam Harris, takes me to the very limits of my intellectual ability. And so even in discussing it, I'm going to make all sorts of mistakes.
As will we.
Because it's treacherous territory. But I would say my understanding of the great myths has that observation built into it.
And he's right. Because, well, why would I say that? Way back when I was a young pup in seminary, I don't remember, what was it, for an assignment or something? I started a close reading of the laws in Exodus and the laws in Deuteronomy. And you know what? They changed. And they're right there in the Bible. Well, why would they change? Well, that's the kind of stuff scholars debate, but Peterson is right. This is built into the systems.
So one of the archetypes is that of the tyrannical father.
Okay, archetypes. What are archetypes? Well, they're these little dramas. That's why, and sometimes in the voice chat in the Discord, they discuss symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary. I'm getting imaginary from Charles Taylor. Okay, imaginary is kind of this non-physical world that is so determinative over what we're doing out there in the world. It's symbolic. I get that from Jonathan Peugeot, because the symbolic world that Jonathan Peugeot lives in is not just static two-dimensional symbols or even static three-dimensional statuary symbols or reliefs. It's behaviors and actions. And that's why I add dramatic. Symbolic, dramatic. Well, what's the drama? Well, these archetypes. It's the demanding father or the overbearing mother, or the hero archetype, or all of these things. They're all acted out. They're forms for actions. They're going on, but they go on repeatedly. Liturgical. Well, why do I add liturgical? Because very quickly, they're not only things that we do, they're things that we do with intentionality. And we're pursuing a better world, or we're pursuing a preferred world, or we're pursuing something else. And again, this is in the imaginary. So symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary. And we're pursuing all of these things, and these are happening.
Which is the archetype, by the way, that possesses the minds of people who accuse Western society of being patriarchal. They're possessed by a singular archetype. And
Okay, what do you mean by possessed? It means that, well, these ideas, they're code, and we start running them. And we don't realize we're running them. And again, when I talked in my previous videos about the fact that we all inherit a first draft, okay? So we inherit a first draft of what it means to be in a married couple from our parent when we're very young. We're not married, we're watching them. We inherit a first draft about how to be a parent when we're very young by watching our parents parent us. We inherit first drafts of all sorts of things, and we don't even recognize we're inheriting them. We don't even recognize we're taking them in. We're being programmed. We're being coded. We're mimetic in that way. We're inheriting all of these first drafts, and these aren't. So now when I say first drafts, you're thinking about a college paper that you worked on, or you wrote a first draft, and then you wrote a better draft. But our first drafts are symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, and they're in the imaginary, because your parents' first draft was, they all read Benjamin Spock, or all of their parents had ideas that they did together, and they were doing it communally, and there were religious institutions, and there were educational institutions, and there were cultural layers, and there was all this stuff coming through them, and all of this stuff gets built into these archetypes. Well, what do I mean by archetype? These are sort of set patterns that happen again and again. And part of Jordan Peterson's point is that this stuff is very deep in us. And we don't know it. It's the programs that are running in us, just like these first drafts we inherited from our parents. And I've used this illustration before, and it's kind of a joke between my wife and myself. Actually, this morning, my wife got up early because she just woke up early, and then I got up, and we're sitting out on the living room sofa, and she's reading news and email and text in anticipation of her day, and I'm sitting and I'm working on the PowerPoint for this video, and then I hear her get up into the kitchen. I hear some pans moving around. She's going to make an egg. I said, "Can you make me one?" And she said, "Yeah." Then I sidled up behind her and I said, "Women making eggs is so sexy." And that's a big joke between us, because the first morning we were married, my mother always got up in the morning and made eggs and made breakfast to the family. My wife didn't grow up in a household where that happened. And so I was like, "Where are the eggs?" And I had never, this is the first morning we were married. I didn't live with my wife. I didn't live together with her before we were married. So I didn't even know I had that first draft, but there it was in my head. Boom. First married morning, get up, and "Why aren't you making eggs, honey? You patriarch." My wife looked at me like, "Make your own damn eggs." "I'm not making you eggs. I don't even eat breakfast." Well, 32 years, every now and then my wife wants to eat breakfast. And so I had, "Honey, can you make me an egg?" "Sure." Often I make the eggs for her, and I would put them in a bag, and then I stopped making eggs. She's like, "Oh, you're not making eggs for me anymore." "Yeah, get used to it." So, this is the stuff that happens. But we got all these first drafts there. And here they are. And they get into these archetypes, and they're far broader. And again, Jung and Peterson following them say that these are in fact nearly universal for human beings. Also, where do they come from? And this gets back to what I first got interested in Peterson, because I wanted to know, how do we make the switch between the scientific and the manifest image? How do we make the bridge? And Peterson's got these ideas about these bridges, and he's getting some of them from Jung. He's getting some of them from others.
That's the archetype of the tyrannical father. They don't see that there's a tyrannical father and a wise king, because there is. That's you can't even point that out. But anyways, in some of our oldest stories, there's a representation of the dead past. So let me give you an example that everyone knows about. The story of Pinocchio is the story of the individualization of Pinocchio.
Okay, so, and he explained this to Susan Blackmore as well. There's not only what we're acting, we start to represent it. And, well, that's how it gets up into the imaginary partly, and that's how it gets communicated, because we're all watching these, and let's say, I'm a little kid, and I've watched my parents relate to one another, so there's the first draft of what a marriage is, and I've watched my parents parent me, so there's my first draft of what parenting is, and then I go over to a friend's house, and I watch their parents relate. And then suddenly I decide, do I like the way my parents relate or the way their parents relate? Or I watch how my friends' parents are parenting them. And then I decide, do I like how my parents parent me or do I like how my friends parent them? And now, again, these are not global. They're just probably one little instance. So in my house, we didn't watch TV on Sundays until after the evening service. But I went over to, sometimes after church, we have other friends who were in our church with us. We'd go over to our friend's house for Sunday afternoon. They watched TV after the morning service. They had World's Strongest Man on ABC. And I thought that was wild. And they even had a color TV. We only had a black and white TV. And it was like, well, maybe I'd like growing up in a household. And they got the Sunday paper. My parents didn't get the Sunday paper. My parents were pretty Sabbatarian. And it's like, well, I kind of like this other household but in the other household, my mother would often put in a roast and potatoes. And so when we'd get home from church, you'd walk into the house. There were these 2 locked doors you had to go through because the house was always getting broken into because of the bad neighborhood we lived in. But so we'd come into we'd get through one locked door and then have to wait until someone would unlock the next door to get into the house. We'd go into the next door. But in that little hallway, that roast in the oven that my mother put in, oh, that roast would smell so good. And then we'd get home from church and get out of our church, our Sunday clothes, and get into laying around clothes. And then Mom would set the table and the roast would come out. That roast just filled the house. And so my friend's house, they ate sort of like cold cuts and Taylor's ham on Sunday. They didn't have a big Sunday noon meal, but they got to watch TV. My house, we had that beautiful roast and that, but then we didn't have TV for the rest of the afternoon until after the evening service, and then we had Disney's the magical world of Disney, so we could watch TV then, but only in black and white because we only had a black and white TV. It's like parents didn't have much money, so just all this stuff, it all gets boiled in, and we all have these ideas, and so we have these representations, and even the little stories I just told. For some of you, got you into a bunch of different ideas about it. And so these archetypes are very big and they're very large and they're very enduring and they go through time.
He starts out as a puppet. He's a marionette. He's a wooden head. He's a liar. And he's pulled by forces that he does not understand.
Right. And what's so powerful about these stories is that they pack so much into them.
Right, okay, but he has a good father, that's Geppetto, and so he's got and Geppetto wishes that he becomes a real individual. And he knows that that's an impossible wish. He wishes on a star that his son could become an actual individual, knowing full well that that's unlikely and impossible. So Geppetto's a good king. But the story's also about Geppetto, because what happens is that when Geppetto loses Pinocchio, loses his son, which you could think about as the active, dynamic, attentive force of youth, then he ends up stultified in the belly of a whale, which is a symbol of chaos, at the bottom of the ocean, and then Pinocchio has to rescue him. So I would say there is an instantiation of evolutionarily accumulated wisdom in the great stories of the past, but they're still dead. And it requires the union. This is why in Christian theology, the Godhead has a tripartite structure.
Now, what he just said there, now he's going to say some other things that Christian theologians would bicker with him over. But what he said there is that that's in the past, and it's got to be living today. And as Peterson says, right, well, you think that you search the scriptures because you find life in them. Now, what is Jesus saying when he says that? He's saying, well, it isn't just the scriptures. You have to, and Jesus has all kinds of parables about this. You can't just read them and know them sort of propositionally. You have to act them out perspectively, procedurally, participatorially. You have to act them out. And that's where the wisdom gets translated, because, Bret, fair enough, the context keeps changing. Now, can we call that truth? So again here, watch the language, pay attention to the objects, time, and action, and reprehensible. Is reprehensible a category of objects? Remember in the talks with Sam Harris where they kept talking about Elvis's guitar? Where is the relationship, why is Elvis's guitar worth so much more money than any other guitar, or Jimi Hendrix guitar, or someone famous's, or Elton John's glass? Why? In what realm is that? Is that in the glass? No, it's in this far bigger world. It's in many ways a metaphorical world. So now let's get into this video. Sam Harris lays out metaphorical truth quite nicely, and notice where it goes.
I think we should touch this issue of metaphorical truth, because I think it still gets at the distance between us.
Sure.
Yep.
And happily, this is your phrase that you have. I mean, you might want to. Do you want to prop up this phrase?
Why not?
Yeah.
So the idea of metaphorical truth, which I think actually is the reconciliation between at least the points that you guys each started out with, is the idea that there are concepts which are literally false, that we can falsify in a scientific, rational sense, but that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you...
Now again, look at all the little disclaimers in a rational sense. He's trying to fit this all into a worldview, sort of like me trying to fit into a suit that my mom bought me when I was 10.
That literally started out with is the idea that there are concepts which are literally false, that we can falsify in a scientific, rational sense, but that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you were if you behave according to the fact that they are false. And
again, come out ahead, like morally? I mean, where is morality in this? Is morality, and again, this is morality a thing that helps you as a community, you as a group, achieve that which you want to achieve? Or is it connected to a destination that is attached to a purpose? I mean, morality is deeply problematic in this world of objects, because there's just no bandwidth for it. There's no frame for it. But we can't get away from it, because communally we need to act this way. And so, this is why things just keep going back to morality. Well, you can't ground your morality. Well, what do you mean? Well, it's well-being. Well, is well-being where you want to ground things? I mean, it wasn't to the well-being of the cow for the roast that my mother made, or was it?
So to call these things simply false is an error. In effect, the universe has left them true in some sense other than a purely literal one. And so religions would then, according to actually what you heard from both Sam and Jordan, religions would fall into this class of things. These are encapsulations of stories.
And again, he's wearing a suit designed for a 10-year-old here. If you add the 4 P's, now suddenly you can have room for this stuff, because what you're getting constrained by is all of this object correspondence issues. And there isn't any room for that. Most of the kind of things you're talking about are perspectival, participatory, procedural, not propositional.
And prescriptions that if you follow them, irrespective of whether they literally describe the universe, you end up with certain advantages that you may not know why they are there, but nonetheless you are ahead of you're ahead of your position if you were to navigate just simply on your perceptions. So
right.
That's the concept.
Yeah, so I think there's a good analogy that you and I stumbled onto after we did a podcast together. You had an analogy about a...
Now watch, he's going to use the gun analogy. Now pay attention to how much of this is participatory and especially procedural. Now you've got bullets and guns to think about, and people that you don't want to have shot bullets go through. So there are some objects here, but this example is so deeply procedural. It just screams out, but they don't have the category for it.
A porcupine that could shoot its quills, which many people balked at, but a listener gave us a better one, which was the idea that anyone who's worked with guns at all must have heard this admonishment to treat every gun as if it is loaded, right? And you actually, last night when I alleged that you believed in God, you corrected me. You said, no, you live as if God exists, right?
It's procedural. It's perspectival. It's participatory. Okay? And Sam's all hung up on the propositional. Is there the super thing up there that I can participatorily and procedurally and perspectively relate to in order to get certain outcomes? That's what Sam is all hung up on, as is Bret. But Jordan's not as hung up on that.
Right, and so this seems like there's a connection here. So if I had a gun here that I wanted to show Bret, if I know anything about guns, I'm going to make damn sure that it's unloaded, right? I'm going to pull back the slide, I'm going to drop the magazine, pull back
unless you want to kill Bret. Again, there's a telos here. There's a whole range of things pointing here. I mean, if Sam sign of like, I'd really love to murder Bret, but I'm afraid I really don't want to do the time, so let's make it look like an accident. It's all built into the agent-arena relationship.
The slide, check the chamber, and do this in a redundant fashion that really looks like I'm suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder. I mean, it is truly redundant. And then I'll hand it to Bret, and if Bret knows anything about guns, he will do the same thing, having just seen me do it. And if he hands it back to me, again, I will do the same thing, even though there may be no ammunition around, right? So it really is crazy at the level of our explicit knowledge of the situation, and yet absolutely necessary to do.
And this is, I think, again, part of the reason why we wouldn't be talking about this metaphorical truth idea if it didn't have something going for it. And I think this is a good analogy of, well, what it's got going for it. And it looks crazy, but within the 4P agent-arena relationship, perspectively, what they do makes sense, but not only just because of guns and bullets, but because of the value of people, the friendship. And again, if it were Sam Harris's desire to get away with murdering Bret, well, he'd act like he's checking and then hand it to Bret, and I didn't know the gun was loaded.
And it's not merely, it runs very deep. I mean, I would, that whole time you're careful not to point the barrel of the gun at anything you would be afraid to shoot. And when people fail to live this way around guns, they, with some unnerving frequency, actually shoot themselves or people close to them by accident. So it is really the only proper hedge against just the odds of being in proximity to loaded weapons. And yet, if someone in the middle of this operation came up to us and said, actually there's a casino that just opened across the street that will take your bets about whether or not guns are loaded. Would you like to bet $1 million as to whether or not this gun is loaded? Well, of course, I would bet those $1 million every time that it's not loaded because I know it's not loaded. So there's
And how do you know it? Okay, there's propositionally all this world of objects in terms of, but again, it's all in relationship to other thing. It's perspectival. It's procedural. It's, that's where this metaphorical truth is lying. It's in these other categories that Bret doesn't have the words for.
There's a literal truth and a metaphorical truth, otherwise known as a very useful fiction, which in this case is actually more useful.
But here's the funny thing about the useful fiction. You're acting as if there might be a bullet in, and you say it's a fiction, but you don't know that it's a fiction. And again, this is where this idea has some sticking. But you're also, when you call it a useful fiction, acting like you know it's not true. So, okay, take a step back and look at both of it. Not just from the inside of saying it's a useful fiction, but from the outside saying, oh, you know that there's no bullet in there. Then why are you doing it? Well, it's because there's not only a dramatical thing, there's a liturgical element to this. I am doing this to save Bret's life. and to save my own life. There's purpose behind it.
Than the truth, right? But the only way I can understand its utility is
utility towards an end,
and even utter the phrase metaphorical truth in a way that's comprehensible is in the context of distinguishing it from literal truth.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
This is fascinating, Sam. Actually, this is I think next phase.
I'm worried by how excited you are. By
Well, so I have a little story that might be helpful about that, and so you can tell me what you think about. You can think about this. Okay, so one of the things that I've been reconsidering since we talked last night is the nature of our dispute about the relationship between facts and values, because I think I can make a case that what I've been trying to do, especially in my first book, was to ground values in facts. But I'm not doing it the same way that you are exactly. So I don't want to make that a point of contention. And I'll get to that in a moment. But with regards to this metaphorical truth, let me tell you something. You tell me what you think about this. So one of the things that's been observed by anthropologists worldwide is that human beings tend to make sacrifices. So I'm going to...
Okay. Why is Jordan going here? Is you're trying to cross the two worlds. Okay. You're trying to cross the two worlds. And that's what these archetypes sort of try to do, to cross the worlds. What are the two worlds? Again, I started with the world of everybody's in church saying, here we are and we're reading the Bible and we believe this is God's word. And we believe, well, what do you mean by God's word? Well, we believe that this is the key to life. Well, what do you mean by life? Well, this also teaches us what a good life is. Oh. But then you go out and you read the story, and there's in Genesis 1, there's the waters above and the waters below, and there's a space in between, and there's a firmament, there's a big dome that holds the waters out, and you separate the waters, and you have these functionaries and all of this stuff going on. But then you go outside and say, no, is the world round? Yes, it's a globe, and the globe. So you have all these representations, okay? So all of this is constructed in a way. And so how do these things get crossed? And for Peterson, sacrifice is a way. And now right away, sacrifice, that's religion S. Okay, well, let's hear him out.
Spend 2 minutes that human beings tend to make sacrifices.
And right away, too, in the word sacrifice, there's an ambiguity, because my parents made sacrifices for me. My parents put me through Christian school, where public school could have been free, and instead they spent money to put their 3 children through Christian school. They made sacrifices. And Sam and Bret would say, no. When you're saying sacrifices, you're meaning like an altar and an animal. And one of the videos, my most popular video on my church channel, is when before I ever heard about Jordan Peterson, was playing with this and was thinking about sacrifices. I thought, well, how do sacrifices work in this world? Well, what do I mean by in this world? Well, on this ball with an animal and a fire, and because I had been going through Leviticus and I was thinking about, there's an entire world built into the sacrificing of those animals. How does that work? And you'd read in the New Testament that the sacrifice, and in the Old Testament, that the sacrifice is a pleasing aroma. Does that mean that God is somewhere in the sky with a big nose going, and that he has what's going on in that world? Well, why do we use the same word for my parents spending their money? Well, let's not even use Christian school, because that gets into religion-S. My parents just having me and spending money on my clothing and on my doctor's appointments and on Christmas presents and all those things that you don't necessarily describe as religious, okay? And those sacrifices versus an altar and an animal and some fire and those things. So why do we use the same word for both of those? So humans like to do sacrifice. And why is that coming into the metaphorical truth thing?
So I'm going to spend 2 minutes, 3 minutes laying out a sacrificial story. And the reason I want to do it is because See, what I think happened with regards to the origin of these profound stories is that people first started to behave in certain ways that had
dramatically
survival significance.
And survival significance. Well, how did they? Well, they began comparing, and they were saying, this is probably where morality came from too, because do this, don't do that. And again, read Yuval Harari. I mentioned this in a sermon recently, how, clans and families and villages, they were all in this stuff together. And so, act this way and not that way. And so, for example, the story of the prodigal son, the father gives the younger brother 1/3 of his estate, let's say, if he only has 2 sons, 1/3 of his estate. And the entire village is going to be horrified at this, because the father was probably the wealthiest man in the village, and it could be that the entire village was sustaining its living off the father's estate. There were shepherds and artisans and people doing other things sort of surrounding the great man and all of his wealth. And so then the younger son comes in and says, liquidate 1/3 of the economy of the village and give it to me. And of course, everybody in the village would say, beat that son. That's moral. Beat him. In fact, beat him publicly. So that every other kid, this infectious idea, this little dramatic liturgical thing that kid is starting, that dies here fast. So beat that kid. Luke 15, the father doesn't. The father gives the kid what he asks for. Everybody in the town thinks we're all in deep trouble because the old man is rounding the bend. And then the kid takes all that money and not only doesn't just keep it all here, but goes to the far off country and squanders it. And so the whole economy of the village takes this huge hit, and everyone's ticked at him. And again, read Kenneth Bailey's interpretation of this. Kenneth Bailey was a scholar, American scholar in Lebanon for years, wrote a variety of books about the cultural interpretations of many of the stories in the Gospels. And Kenneth Bailey notes that what would be expected to happen, why the old man will run, why he keeps looking out for his son, is because he knows his son's an idiot. And yet he gave his son the money. And it's a parable because, well, this is how parables work. And he gave the son the money. He knows his son's an idiot, and he's keeping watching for the son because he knows what's going to happen. That kid's going to come back because the kid's not that dumb. Because the kid's going to go out into the harsh world and he's going to blow all the money. He's not going to have anything to eat, and he's going to come back. And he knows that the village elders are going to get out there on the road, and this is what Kenneth Bailey goes into, with a clay pot, and it'll have corn in it. It's like, what does that have to do with anything? Oh, it's symbolic. It's a symbolic, dramatic, liturgical. And they're going to go out with this clay pot with corn in it, and when they see the sun come, they're going to bar the road, and they're going to smash it in front of them and say, this is you. We're never going to see you again. If you come around here again, we're probably going to kill you. And the father doesn't want that. So what does the father do? He runs like a girl, robes, exposing himself. He's an old man, but he's going to beat the elders. Why? Because he loves his son. And this, of course, is nested in Luke 15. So read the whole chapter if you can see what the point Jesus is making and to whom, because it's nested in a context. But he's going to go out there, and he knows that the village elders are coming, and he knows that he's got influence, they've got tradition on their side, but he's going to, and so what does he do? He throws his robe around him. Well, what does that mean? That means I'm cladding him in my reputation and my influence, and so don't touch him, because I'm the big monkey in this jungle. Put shoes on his feet. Put a robe on him. Put my ring on him. Kill the fattened calf. And of course the older brother, who's out in the field, is ticked off because he's with the village elders. He wanted to see his worthless brother dead. Well, that's the story. That's morality. That's how we work. Okay, back to sacrifice.
And that was selected for, as a consequence, is that people first started to behave in certain ways that had survival significance. And that was selected for as a consequence of the standard selection practices. And So that was instantiated in behavior. And then because we can observe ourselves, because we're self-conscious creatures, that we started to make representations of those patterns and dramatize them and then encapsulate them in stories. So it's a bottom up so it would be sort of like chimpanzees or wolves become aware of their dominance hierarchy structures and the strategies that they use. So a wolf, for example, if two wolves are having a dominance dispute, the wolf that gives up first lays down and puts his neck open so the other wolf can tear it out, and then the other wolf doesn't. And you could say, well, it's as if a wolf is following a rule about not killing a weaker member of the pack. Of course, wolves don't have rules. They have behavioral patterns.
Wolves don't write things down. They have patterns. And these patterns have gotten into wolves' and also little baby wolf grows up, suckling. Okay, little wolf, let me tell you. Now, we have stories about mama wolf telling little wolf and so on and so forth, but they acted out and they imprinted on the others, just like, not that different from the first draft of my parents' marriage and my parents' parenting. They acted out, and they don't have, the left brain doesn't suss out little articulated rules from the right brain, but they map it out and they act it out.
Weaker. And you could say, well, it's as if a wolf is following a rule about not killing a weaker member of the pack. Of course, wolves don't have rules. They have behavioral patterns. But a self-conscious wolf would watch what the wolves were doing and then say, well, it's as if we're acting out the idea that each wolf in the pack has intrinsic value. And then that starts to be, and maybe the wolves would have a little story about the heroic forbearing wolf that doesn't tear out the neck of its opponents, and that's good wolf. Well, that's good wolf ethics, and so, but it's grounded in the actual behavior. Okay, so we'll put that aside for a second. Now, here's the sacrificial story. So human beings have made sacrifices. It seems to be a standard practice all around the world. And in the biblical narratives, they would often sacrifice something of value, like a valuable animal.
Well, like a child. Let's start.
And this is why you can't have conversations with Sam Harris.
Well, no. Look. I'm not making light of this. I know that human sacrifice was a part of this.
Yeah, but that's again. So just to give you a crib on where my mind goes here is.
Yep.
As if we didn't know.
Human sacrifice is as old a religious precept.
Now, this is a complete distraction from Jordan's argument, but we'll bring it around.
As we know about.
Yes.
It's a cultural universal. The other sacrifices are derivations from it. Circumcision is a surrogate for the far more barbaric act of human sacrifice.
And why is it barbaric, Sam? Where is that knowledge from? This moral knowledge that's, there's things there that are actually productive, things there that actually work, but they're reprehensible. Okay, that's what Bret just said in the video with Joe Rogan. And now, here we have an example, right?
And, it answers every test you would put to it with respect to its archetypal significance, its compelling presence in stories across all cultures. But the horror is that it actually has taken place in all these cultures based on explicit beliefs in the presence of just
right. Well, Arthur
oppressive
Koestler,
scientific ignorance.
Arthur
right?
Koestler used that as the argument for the essential insanity of humanity. Right?
But it's not just the insanity of humanity, it's the misapprehension of the causal structure of the cosmos. You don't know what controls the weather, you don't know why people get sick, you think your neighbor is capable.
This is why you don't talk to Sam Harris.
Of casting magic spells on.
Not a good conversation partner.
You. You're ignorant of everything, and you're trying to force some order on things. And so when you don't, in the absence of engineers, and you don't know why certain buildings fall down, you act.
Well, what makes you think child sacrifice is reprehensible? Where did that idea come from? It was a nearly universal idea. We already established that. How did the idea suddenly come out of our culture that child sacrifice? In fact, my parents sacrificed for their child.
Actually can agree with your neighbor that maybe you should bury your firstborn child into every post hole of this new building, which in fact took.
How many firstborn children do you have, Sam?
Place, and it's the consequence of ignorance. And so that the problem is if.
consequence of ignorance. Okay, so what exactly is Sam's complaint? There's a super thing. There isn't a super thing. You can relate to the super thing. Well, it's not there, so you can't relate to it. And we have all these bad ideas about it. Now, here's the problem. Where did those bad ideas come from? They certainly must have had utility in the past. And that's what Bret argues, and I think Sam would probably, they certainly must have had utility in the past. Why would sacrificing a child get you somewhere? And why, although it was reprehensible, it got you someplace? Why was that? What's going on in this world, Sam?
If you're only going to talk about this purified notion of sacrifice.
But it's a very strange consequence of ignorance, Sam. Like,
well, it's the notion that we're in relationship to invisible others that can...
the super things.
That can mistreat us based on our not having offered enough.
We're
in relation to invisible others, and Jordan says we are. Why? Well, in what way? In what way? Where are these invisible others? Well, where are the parents that wrote your first draft? Maybe they're in the cemetery, but are your parents really in the cemetery, or are they in their head? Well, what are my parents? And Jordan would probably say, your parents are patterns. What? Your parents are patterns. That's what they are to you. They're patterns that were instantiated in flesh and blood, but you keep seeing them as objects. What they really were parents. Were patterns.
Not precisely those others.
Well, but we're in relationship to the invisible others who will judge us in the future.
The imaginary. The right side of history. Isn't that what we hear all the time? The right side of history. And when he says this to Sam, this is a huge point, because Sam keeps wanting to leverage our reputation in the future, but it's like, well, wait a minute, Sam. You might say that your parents weren't patterns, and that they're buried in the ground, or your grandparents or great-grandparents. I don't want to, wish anything ill on Sam's parents, but that they're no longer here. Well, it's the world of objects. They're no longer here. But no, your parents are still very much with you. And the ancestors are still very much with you. And all of this stuff is still very much with you. It's built into us, and it continues to live in the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical imaginary. And it's still up there, and they're up there. But it's like, well, in what sense are they up there? Okay, well, that's a valid conversation that we can have, but we should have it with a little bit of humility, because we're not entirely sure. But we know in some ways they really are with us to quite a strong degree. My father, although he died in 2013, is still with me. In fact, the more I do these videos, the more I feel him with me all the time. I said, "Oh, Paul, that sounds really wooish." And I don't mean it in a wooish way at all. I find all of the ways that first draft that my father gave me is built into me. And you might say, well, I don't think not all that first draft is correct. And I'd say, well, that's true. And I learned in my marriage not all of my parents' parenting first draft, or my parents' partnering first draft was correct. And I learned in having children that not all their parenting first drafts are correct. And we're continuing the process of updating that. But to say that they're not here, well, what do we mean by them? And what do we mean by our parents? And what really is a human being?
Okay, but again, you're changing the noun in important ways.
I know. But I'm also trying to understand, and I'm not trying to argue against the horror of child sacrifice.
No, I would never imagine you would.
I know.
Why not? Doesn't he at least act as if there is a God? And isn't that what you expect? Isn't that the charge, that people who believe in the super thing and read the Iron Age books somehow continue to hold slaves and practice child sacrifice? They don't. Why not? Answer the questions.
But I'm also trying to.
But my work would be much easier if you did that.
Yes.
Well, you'd have to visit him in prison.
Yes, and the work of journalists as well. Although they've tried that pretty much anyways.
That's right.
So. Right, that would even be worse than enforced monogamy, hypothetically.
No doubt.
Yes. So see, let's say that I'm trying to give the devil his due, and I'm trying to understand from an evolutionary perspective, like a cognitive behavioral evolutionary perspective, let's say, why that particular set of ideas would emerge, and in many places, perhaps autonomously, or once having emerged, would spread like wildfire. It's like, because I'm not willing to only attribute it to ignorance. Now, we can attribute it to ignorance, no problem, man. But there's more going on there because it is a human universal. And like there's all sorts of things that happen in nature as a consequence of biological and evolutionary processes that don't work out well for our current state of moral intuition, let's say.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things, because I've been thinking about this sacrificial motif for a very long time, and trying to figure out, well, what the hell's the idea here exactly? And so here's one.
And not just idea. What is going on with why do we keep repeating it? Why is the word still lingering? Why do we, instead of my parents placing me on an altar to offer me up to a god, why did my parents deny themselves better cars and better clothing and better food and better vacations just so they could have little Paul, Lori, and Ruth running around?
One way of thinking about it. If you give up something of value now, you can gain something of more value in the future.
Time, form for action. We're traveling through time. We're patterns traveling through time.
Okay, so let's think about that idea for a minute. So the first thing is, that's a hell of an idea.
Yeah,
that's delayed gratification.
Yeah, delayed gratification.
That's right. That's the discovery of the future as well. And so you might say, well, the notion of sacrifice is exactly the same thing as the discovery of the future. If we give up something we really value now, we can make a pact with the structure of existence itself such that better things will happen to us in the future. Now,
yes.
Okay, now what's weird about this, and it's hard to understand, is that it works. So when I talk to my students, for example, and I say, what did your parents sacrifice to send you to university? Many of them are children of first-generation immigrants. And so, like, man, they're on that story in a second, right? They know all sorts of things that their parents sacrificed. And they're delaying gratification in the present for a radically delayed return in the future. Now, you think, animals, generally speaking, they might act out the idea of delayed gratification as a consequence of running out their instincts, but they don't conceptualize it. It's not obvious that animals give up something they value right now in order.
And they don't represent it in dramatical, liturgical ways.
In order to thrive in the future. There's an old story about how to catch a monkey, right? So you put a jar up with rocks and candies in front of the jar, grabs the. I don't know either, and I've heard various claims, but the point is, you can go pick up the monkey. He won't let go of the candy.
And that's sort of, well, what's that little story? Well, that story's sort of is it a literal truth? Is it a metaphorical truth? Oh, but it communicates the heart of what we're trying to communicate.
Now, perhaps he would, but the issue is that it's not obvious that animals will forego an immediate gratification for a future gratification.
I don't think that's right, actually. And I actually want to hold.
Well, the question is, will they do it consciously? They might act it out. They act it out. That's not the issue.
It's very hard to know if it's conscious because they won't respond to the questionnaires. But
I know, and obviously the line between acting it out and starting to consciously represent it is a tenuous one.
And not only consciously represent it, but represent it in all of the ways that human beings represent things, in writing, in art, in stories, and in all of these things. That's how we represent it. Oops, got to move my window over. So notice here, again, this is why I complain about Sam as a conversation partner, because I've watched him now with Bret and with Jordan, and Sam is like an evangelical. Well, how is he like an evangelical? He keeps going for the kill too fast. Because, human sacrifice, immoral. Well, where did it get started? You're not giving ontology, and you're not giving even the reality of what you're complaining about. You're assuming it's reality. You're not giving it its due. Because why? Didn't those people love their children? Isn't that biologically built into us? We talk about that all the time, where the mother has the child and looks down at the child and the hormones are flooding and they love that child. And you have to overcome all of that for this other thing. That people would actually sacrifice. Of course, now Agamemnon sacrifices, and Agamemnon's wife didn't take it very kindly. But there's so much going on here, and you're just simply not you're not looking at it fairly in terms of everything. But also notice how immediately we go to the moral. And Sam says why did the moral course, maybe, okay, let's pick a date, maybe 3,000 years ago in Moab, the arc of history bent towards child sacrifice. Why did it bend the other way now? Well, because you're thinking about, and Peterson nails him on that. Well, you're thinking about your reputation among your among your descendants, how they will regard you in history, to be on the right side of history. Think about all of this, and this is all operating with us today. Now, what's really interesting about this is we don't do child sacrifice. We do child sacrifice all the time. Just right now in the news, Scott Peterson is going to Scott Peterson, who killed his pregnant wife Lacey. This was a huge story in California a number of years ago. And how could he kill his pregnant wife? And he killed his unborn child. We continue to have these political discussions about how to regard our unborn children. In fact, not too long ago, and on Twitter before we had COVID and we're fighting about abortion, hashtag me, everybody saying, well, I had an abortion. It was the right decision for me, and it wasn't a hard one. My husband and I were working more than full time and had 3 kids already. I was fortunate that at the time, accessing abortion in Texas was not the nightmare it is now. That's not child sacrifice? Well, what is a child? Why, on one case in California, a very blue state, was Scott Peterson's crime so... The reprehensibility of Scott Peterson's crime was because his wife was pregnant with his child, for all we know. Why was that so reprehensible? I mean, and for Cecile Richards, and I just plucked her out of the air. I have no idea who she is. For Cecile Richards, it's just a choice. To kill that. Well, it's got distinct genetics. It's not like cutting off your foot, doctor-assisted foot cutting. No, it's doctor-assisted abortion. And you're plucking out cells that have a distinct DNA from you, mom, and you're deciding to end its trajectory. You're deciding to stop its pattern. Peterson likes talking about Rousseau. I picked this up because I've been reading again Rousseau and Revolution, Will and Ariel Durant's The Story of Civilization, volume 10. When she became, so Rousseau figured he wasn't making enough money to actually have a wife, so he'd just have a mistress. And he decided that his relationship with this woman, she wasn't a very well-educated woman. She wasn't that beautiful, but he had needs. He had like sexual needs, and so she would be there for his sexual needs. And he would feed her, and he would clothe her, and sometimes give money to her mother, and yada yada. And she was a very dutiful mistress, and that's how she lived. But he didn't take a wife because, like a wife would be, then you're having heirs, and you need money for children and all those things. And so Rousseau, and at that point, mistresses were very common, and people understood what a mistress was and what a wife was. And I'm not promoting this idea, but that's, read Durant. It'll tell you all about it. When his mistress became pregnant, he was thrown into the greatest embarrassment. What? Jacques Rousseau didn't understand where babies come from? What could he do with children? Oh, fair point. Some friends assured him it was quite customary to send unwanted offspring to a foundling asylum. Put it on the doorstep and run away. Ding dong! That's the respectable thing to do. Oh, child sacrifice went away. There are many ways to sacrifice a child. When the infant came, this was done. After Teresa's protests, but with the cooperation of her mother in 1747, in the next 8 years, 4 other children came. 5 children he did this to. And they were disposed of in the same way. Some skeptics have suggested, well, would it have been better to kill them? Well, what are the children? Are they objects in the world? Well, sort of. They have bodies and skin and all these. Or are they patterns? Or are they stories? And how, in fact, do you represent them? Some skeptics have suggested that Rousseau never had any children and that he invented the story to hide his impotence. He and Voltaire had issues. But his many apologies for the shrinking of responsibility make this theory improbable. He privately confessed his behavior in this matter to Diderot, Grimm, and Mademoiselle d'Épinay. He implicitly acknowledged it in Émile. He raged against Voltaire for making it public. Well, if there wasn't anything wrong with it, why are you ashamed of it? What is morality? Well, it's publicly, you're right, you're wrong. You're going to have higher status. You're going to have lower status. We're going to elevate you and reward you. We're going to punish you and maybe put your life at risk. It's morality, right? And we do it together. And we do it along the lines of a whole bunch of ideas, symbolic, dramatical, liturgical, imaginary, in that realm. And we say good, bad, right, or wrong. So in the one moral rule that seems to be holding in America today is don't cheat. Well, in 18th century France, it was, well, you can have a mistress and you can have a wife. Don't rub her face in it. You don't want to do that, but you can have a wife and a mistress, and the wife is for heirs and the mistress is for pleasure. And you can find ancient materials that say basically the same thing with respect to female slaves or male slaves or boys. He implicitly acknowledged it in Émile. In the Confessions, he admitted it explicitly and expressed remorse. Not remorse to go and find the kids. He was not made for family life. But that didn't stop him from doing other things. Being a skinless mass of nerves and a wanderer in body and soul, he missed the sobering care of children and never quite became a man. That's why I love Durant's writing. His little just bang. Missed the sobering care of children. Well, what do children do? Well, children raise you. And when you sacrifice for children, you discover the future. And you say, okay, this is going to cost me a lot of money now. Now, for me, parenting, so much of the stuff is the first draft. What do you do with your children? Again, some of this came up in my sermon about honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Oh, that sounds like you're engaging the super thing. Well, you can read it in another way and say, well, you know what? If your children watch you caring for your parents, guess what? In their first draft, they will probably begin by caring for you, unless you muck it up by being a real idiot to them. So there's patterns that go on here, and the patterns get represented, and they get instantiated into these texts, and these texts take on authority because large numbers of community begin to revolve around these texts, and they uphold these texts. But there's an epigenetic layer to this, and they don't all, and again, if you read the history of biblical interpretation, you find some texts are relevant now and some texts are relevant later, and so the community is all processing this, but they actually have a lot to work with respect to these things, and so it's part of the reason Christianity says abortion is a really bad thing. And it was very interesting listening to Kanye West with Joe Rogan, and Kanye West making the point, 1,000 children, did he say a day? Could that be? 1,000 children a day, 1,000 black children a day, 1,000 children of, more children of color, 1,000 black children a day, or I don't know what the statistic is. I'm sure someone will provide it. And, this is a black genocide, Kanye says. And what was so interesting about that conversation is Joe Rogan just sat through it. It's fascinating. Well, so what are we? And what is metaphorical truth, and how does it work? So one of the interesting sub-conversations within these conversations between Jordan and Sam revolved around stories. And, what's the relationship between story and metaphorical truth? Well, stories are knowledge containers that are far more powerful, memorable, relatable. They're representations. They're far more personable than facts as knowledge containers, and they far better represent 4 P's of knowledge: propositional, participatory, procedural, and perspectival. Just look at the common complaint of high school students in history class. All we learn about is wars and dates. But you get a good teacher, good history teacher, and he'll tell you stories. And your history teacher will say, well, dates are hooks. They help you to organize the stories, but if we read something like Will Durant, it's just all stories, and they weave it together nicely into stories. And now notice the metaphorical nature of this. Here comes the video.
You can tell stories by way of communicating certain ideas. I mean, that's obviously, I'm not saying stories aren't incredibly powerful and useful and inevitable, right? It's like we
Wait, I think you are. You might not be saying that they're not inevitable, but you are debating their utility and power, because you said that you don't need the story.
And again, utility and power for what? For living.
As an intermediary.
Now we have a few doors open here, which I think we should
Okay.
we should extract the most out of these areas that we've touched and not run on to something else. So
Okay.
I think there's, to talk about the utility of story, right, which is obviously a fact about the world and about human psychology that you're reading a lot into, and more into than I'm reading, right? And the people we just heard from love that you.
Well, maybe I'm reading more into it than you are. I'm not sure about that.
But you talk a lot about the primacy of stories, and you are trying to get me to admit that even I helplessly resort to.
Well, why would stories be so prime? Well, because stories can embody way more truth than these ideas about your facts out there.
Storytelling to make my points, right?
Well, you did there.
I think this is a good place.
And he keeps doing it.
For us to, and I don't want us to get bogged down, but I think it's a good place for us to touch this topic of the distinction between literal and metaphorical truth,
okay.
which you might want to introduce it, but because that in my mind that covers this different emphasis on stories.
Okay, briefly, but we are at start Q&A. So argument that were true, you comes
right. They're so useful. Right,
well, but you also look, this is what happens in the moral landscape, I think. Tell me why I'm wrong, because I'm really trying to understand it. See, I think you dealt with G.E. Moore's problem of infinite regress by staking a moral proposition. And your moral proposition was, look, here's a way things can be horrible, and here's a way things can be good. Can we accept that this is horrible and this is good, and that we should move towards good? And if the answer is yes, we can accept that, then we can proceed. And maybe we can even proceed with extracting values from facts, but we have to accept that a priori presupposition first. And you insist that we have to accept it because it's objectively true. And I don't think that's correct.
Because you can't just find it. And in fact, heaven and hell, it's all going to be stories.
Let me just get the proposition clear. Yeah. So my argument is that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad.
That's hell.
Okay, so hell is the religious version of that, but you can forget about religion or whether there's a God.
Religion-S.
Or anything else.
The super thing.
We live in a universe that admits of the possibility of experience. I'm asking you to imagine a universe where every conscious mind, every mind that can have an experience, is tuned to the worst possible experience for that mind for as long as possible. So there's no silver lining, there are no lessons learned.
There's no purpose, there's no meaning. That's really what he's saying right here.
Everything that can suffer, suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can.
And you might say, well, if there's no meaning, well, maybe fortunately we don't suffer that way, but there's no meaning.
Now that includes human beings, it includes animals, it includes future AI that we might build that can suffer. It includes beings that we'll never know about, right? So my argument is that's bad. If anything
of course it's bad.
Is bad, that's bad.
Okay.
We don't disagree that hell is bad.
If the word bad is going to mean anything, that's bad. And you can't say...
But what's so interesting is how he takes meaning out of it right from the start. And Peterson's whole point is, well, happiness isn't... People exchange happiness for meaning all the time. And Sam basically just simply admitted it there.
That's fine, but it's not a factual claim.
No,
it's not a fact. That's right. It's within this other realm of, and that's why he said, well, maybe this is where metaphorical comes in. Why? Because it's a story. It's a metaphor. It's all live being played out.
It is. It's a fact. It's a claim about. So I would argue to you, and again, if this, it's hard to impart this intuition if someone doesn't share it. But
isn't that the true of every intuition?
If someone doesn't share this intuition, I have no way of interpreting any other word that comes out of their mouth after they admit they don't share this.
That's one heck of a presuppositionalism.
So I mean, so just imagine someone saying.
But even that doesn't make it a factual claim.
No, so again.
So you guys are going to get stuck here, and I think you're going to.
Yeah. No.
There's a certain stuckness with Sam Harris. So I think better than the idea of all these truths plus metaphorical truth trying to get at the 4 Ps, I think Peugeot's perspective is actually more useful. We live in a world of patterns.
One of the problems with scientists in general is that they're standing and they look at the world and they try to see patterns in the world. Okay. Now, one of the difficulties, and I think it's actually kind of some physicists right now are seeing the problem, but not a lot of them aren't. So the question is there a pattern to the way you look at the world? So it's not just the world that has a pattern. You also are patterned.
Now the volume's a little low here. So you are patterned. You look at the world with a pattern, and you are a pattern.
And your mechanisms of understanding are patterned.
Your mechanisms of understanding are patterned.
So it's not like you're a weird objective, like completely neutral thing.
So it's not like you have monarchical vision. You're some weird objective, completely neutral thing looking at a world of objects. You are a pattern, and what you're looking at are fundamentally patterns.
Looking at a patterned world, you are also patterned, and your perception is patterned. And so then that's when symbolism comes into the sphere. So it's like, do your thoughts have a pattern that are similar to the patterns that you view in the cosmos? Does your family have a pattern similar to the patterns you view in the cosmos?
So when we have these morally reprehensible things like child sacrifice, well, Sam Harris is a pattern, and Sam Harris is a pattern that's been replicated and reproduced out into the 20th century. And so when he hears about child sacrifice and thinks about Agamemnon or maybe Abraham and Isaac or how many things in the ancient world or the Aztecs or all of this, he says, it's morally reprehensible. And, well, the patterns that were back in the other day said, no, that's just what you got to do. But then if you say, well, abortion is child sacrifice, he'd say, no, because it's not religion S. You're not sacrificing to a god, but you can interrupt the pattern of a pregnancy if it's an inconvenient time, if the mother agrees, whether or not the father agrees. But when Scott Peterson interrupts the pattern of the pregnancy, there are additional consequences for not only killing his wife, but killing the unborn baby. And the same society says both. Say, well, what's going on with these patterns? Now I got to fix my little square again. So we are patterns seeing patterns, and I just wanted to play that because I've used it again and again and again, and I wanted to note that it was in this. You can find this video of Jonathan Peugeot talking with Andrea with the Bangs and Mercury. You can find it on all 3 of their channels. And so John Buck, I've spoken with John Buck. John Buck found my channel early on. John Buck actually has quite a good video out there on what is metaphorical truth with a lot of, and he did it 2 years ago, or almost 2 years ago now. It's really quite a good video. And so Bret Weinstein's main argument is that, well, what if the surrounding patterns are different? Now, Metaphorical truth is using the word metaphor, and metaphors are basically mimetic patterns. And one of the things that John Buck notes on his video is that, let's say you look at Inherit the Wind, where it looks at the Scopes trial, and the Scopes trial, if you watch the movie or look at the play Inherit the Wind, it's looking, actually it doesn't make this comment I'm making this analogy, but Inherit the Wind about the Scopes trial is actually about the McCarthy hearings. And they're basically making an argument that, well, it's these religious fundamentalists that are causing the problem. Well, what's interesting about using the word metaphor here is that, well, what is a metaphor? Well, you're saying that something is like the other thing. And in fact, all language is metaphorical in that way. And one thing is like the other, so it's a metaphorical truth. Well, even your propositional truth, which is a correspondence thing, are looking at essences and saying, well, those essences match up. And the language we're using, oxygen is oxygen. But what does oxygen mean? Oxygen means one thing if you're scuba diving, and it means another thing if you're worrying about your iron or your copper oxidizing. Okay? It means different things in different forums. And so Bret Weinstein's point is that, well, these moral truths, well, they're reprehensible. And he always just talks as if that's static. As if, no, they're reprehensible to you. But where are you? Well, you're in this long history of patterns. And you're looking at the representations from past histories of patterns, but as Jordan said, but it's got to actually be living, and that's built into the whole idea of the whole enterprise. So past experience, action A, action B, one gets a check, one gets an X. Present experience, action A, I'm not sure what the little line means, action B gets a check, but then Jordan Peterson makes the point that, well, what do we do with stories is we abstract out of all of the things around us something, and well, it's sort of metaphorical, but we don't not quite know what that thing is. It's in the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary. It's sort of up there, and we abstract that out of all of it, and we say, okay, abortion good or bad? Well, was abortion okay in the Roman period when they brought the baby to term because it was safer probably to give birth to the child and then abandon it on the city dump? Was it better in Rousseau's to have Teresa give birth to the child and to leave it at the foundling asylum? That's grim. Or is it better to interrupt the pattern earlier on? Well, this gets into all kinds of things, but pay attention to what we're doing here. One pattern is like the other. There are differences in the patterns that involve the objects. And those differences, so if you look at Inherit the Wind, which is about the Scopes trial, and you look at the McCarthy hearings, well, we're looking at the patterns and we're looking at essences. And part of the art in Inherit the Wind is to make a statement about, well, all of us really believe this thing about evolution, and this McCarthyism is, again, a religious thing. Oh, well, what's the relevance? Relevance realization is key in all of this. So your metaphorical truth. Look at all the metaphors. Gun safety patterns. The Boxing Day tsunami. Porcupine and its quill. Now, I want to get to the Boxing Day tsunami pattern because it's very clearly a pattern. Now, the pattern is encoded in a story, and there are actors and agents in the story. And that's that element that Bret sort of objects to. So the metaphorical truth story of the Boxing Day tsunami goes like this. There was a tsunami, and a certain group of people had a religious story that talked about that there are spirits that govern the waters, and when the waters recede, well, you'd better head for high ground. And that story saved the life of everyone in that tribe, but many other people were killed because when the waters receded, there were fish out there flapping. People went out to get the fish. It was strange. It was novel, so they went out, and then the tsunami came in. Huge loss of life. Okay, what are the patterns? If we look at this with respect to patterns, we're going to learn a lot more. Now, they get hung up on are there spirits out there or not? That's a really rather stupid thing to get hung up on. Why? Well, think about the story. Is there a bullet in there or not? Oh, okay. Well, that's kind of relevant. Is there a spirit, a super thing, that moves the water? Now you might say, well, there kind of are super things. Is a tectonic plate a super thing? Yeah, but it's not conscious. Okay. It doesn't fill out forms either. Is a volcano or an earthquake a super thing? Well, yeah, an earthquake's a super thing. Is it conscious? Doesn't fill out forms. Does the earthquake coincide in terms of patterns with whether or not you're sacrificing? Bret and I would probably share doubts there, but it's a pattern. And spirit isn't a dumb thing when you think about what spirit is to reflect on with respect to these patterns. You really want to look more at patterns. And in some ways, part of what, let's say, a modern seismic scientist would have is far more information at hand of a certain kind provided by the scientific revolution. And again, the point is that, this was a really smart thing to do. Let's act as if it's not a conscious being that we're relating to that is causing the tsunami, and let's find some of the other causes. And we know that there are many causes potentially. Let's find some of the other causes that are relevant to the pattern of tsunamis. Okay? So you really want to look more at the pattern, which the tribe did, than the objects. Because the water's there, the ground under the water's there, and the waves are there, and the tides are there, and the tribe really knows all of those patterns so well. And then there's this anomaly in the pattern, and the tribe says, oh, there's a spirit. Now, of course, Bret can't tell us whether or not there is a spirit, because by definition, the spirit, he might be skeptical, and he and I both might be skeptical in some ways about this, but it's not something that you can decide scientifically, and I think Bret would acknowledge that. But now, spirits or persons are far more pattern than objects to us relevantly. What do I mean by that? Bret has been married to his wife for a long time. The pattern of Heather is probably more important to him in terms of a hierarchy than the body of Heather. Let's say, heaven forbid, they would have an accident and they would have to amputate one of her legs. Probably everyone would say, it's better to have the leg amputated than to lose your life. Why? Because then the pattern of Heather can continue. Now, the pattern would be disrupted because they would miss her leg. But the pattern of Heather would continue because most of the pattern of Heather is not necessarily involved in that leg. And there can be other accommodations to keep the general pattern going. People are more patterns. That unborn baby is a pattern. Your neighbor is a pattern. Now, the body stuff, that's changing. All of that is changing as we go. But what you really care about is the pattern. Now, what that tribe has done is taken that pattern and instantiated in a story. And that story is more powerful in a lot of ways than all of the data out there, because you go to people and say, tectonic plates. Huh? No, the story is more powerful. And in Jordan Peterson's Darwinian Truth, the story is more true. Well, why? How would you say that? Because the story actually arrives at its conclusion. The story actually achieves its telos. The story actually fulfills the pattern. Because the story saved the lives of the people of the village who had that particular religious belief, and not so much the others who had little bits and shreds of the scientific idea, but they were sort of plugged into a bigger network that potentially had more information to it, but it was in many ways more deficient than the religious story that the little group of people had. That's the power of this metaphorical truth. Now, you might say, well, they believed in a spirit. That was wrong. Well, you don't know that. Well, please explain to me what a spirit is. Well, let's try that, because I don't think it's that hard. And I did this as I was teaching one of my Sunday school lessons, and because one of the things that I've noticed for years is that we use this word, I'm spiritual but not religious. What does that mean? Well, where do we use the word spirit that Bret Weinstein wouldn't have a problem with? Well, let's use the example of school spirit. Now, modernity is really hung up on spirit, again, because of a lot of the issues in the 18th century. It looks for tiny, discrete processes by which tracking objects. And if we would say the spirit of electricity releases the oxygen and hydrogen from the water, they wouldn't balk at that, but they'd be a little nervous about that word. Well, the question is, what moves the world? What moved the water in the tsunami? Well, the tectonic plates. What moved the tectonic plates? Well, volcanism. What moved volcanism? Well, in one eye, you can kind of go with Sam Harris all the way back to the beginning and say everything started at the Big Bang. Well, what got the Big Bang? Well, don't ask that question. Anyway, everything started at the Big Bang, and whoosh, the whole show. C.S. Lewis's Book of Miracles. Okay, right there. It's the whole show. And all my thoughts and all my ideas and everything we're doing, it's all one pattern, that one initiation point, and it's just playing itself out, and there's no meaning and there's no purpose. And again, it's so ironic when Sam Harris is laying out hell, there's all this suffering and it has no purpose. And it's like, have you been listening to what Jordan Peterson has been saying? I don't think so. Anyway, school spirit. What is school spirit? And if I say school spirit, you say, I totally understand what school spirit is. Well, what do you totally understand about school spirit? Well, some schools have a lot of spirit to them. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, you go there and, well, there's physical manifestations of that school spirit all over the hallways. There's posters. They're having a pep rally. People are friendly. They're wearing their school mascot on their shirts. They're showing up to the basketball game to cheer their team. They have a good attitude. They learn well. Now, is any individual person in charge of school spirit? Well, kind of the pep rally and the cheerleaders and the teachers and the principal, and what else? What all goes into school spirit? Oh gosh, what things cause school spirit? Nearly innumerable. The culture that the school is in, the community that the school is in, the history of the community that the school is in, not only geographically, but if those people have moved there. Thing after thing after thing. What kinds of people the high status students were, the jocks and the nerds, and were they kind? Did they have good parents? What kinds of religions were around? It's all this stuff goes into school spirit. Now, school spirit is created. Why do we call it spirit? Well, because it moves the school. And it shapes the school, and it gets instantiated in the school, and there are representatives of it that come, and school spirits almost become archetypes, but they're too small really for archetypes, and so spirit is the right word. Okay, how do you relate to the school spirit? Yeah, you can participate in school spirit, you can initiate school spirit, you can make it better, you can make it worse. And then someone will say, well, does school spirit have consciousness? That's a lot harder. But again, we can't really answer that question. Now, I had quite a bit of back and forth on this in the last Discord Q&A that maybe I'll post. So I'm recording this on Monday, and I'm going to release this on Tuesday. So maybe I'll post that Q&A on Monday afternoon. Quite a bit of conversation on that because the Christians were a little bit nervous because, well, Paul, are you selling out too much? Are you saying, how does this revolve around the traditional way that Christians talk about the spiritual realm? And my argument is going to be, I'm probably not going to make it here, but people have actually been sending me emails about this because you sort of anticipate where I'm going with a bunch of these things because, well, how much do we know about what's on the other side? And that's exactly where Jordan Peterson keeps winding up again and again. Let's use McClatchy High because it's a historic, one of the historic high schools here in Sacramento that some of my children went to. Where is the spirit of McClatchy High? Well, it's in the walls, it's in the people, it's actually beyond the people because it's built into all of the patterns that are people that have been alumni of McClatchy High. Is it in the heavenlies? I don't think so, but I can't really say. Are there other spirits that are far older? And actually, if you watch the Matrix movies, they have some of those ideas built into, like the Merovingian and the Keymaker, and so you have all these other spirits, as it were, that are operating in the movie. And so then people would say things like, well, how about... See, part of what happens if you read, let's say, Frank Peretti's books is that there's this divorce between the spiritual and the material. But if you read C.S. Lewis, and if you think about the Bible carefully, basically the assertion is that human beings are sort of amphibious. We create spirits. We create school spirit. We create the spirit of a town, the spirit of a household, the spirit of a family. And these are patterns. And we don't know. We know that these patterns get instantiated into buildings, and they get built into people's lives. If your school spirit in one way or another incentivized smoking in the 1960s and 70s, that school spirit brought lung cancer into people's lives. How about the spirit of the automobile? And what these archetypes are, in some ways, are very ancient spirits. Well, why are you using the word spirit? Are they conscious? Well, what is consciousness? You see, what's so interesting is that, we're knocking on all these doors, even with people like Sam Harris and Bret Weinstein, but they have these certain dismissals that are just as dogmatic as religious dogmas. And some of these dismissals are well-founded, but they're just assertions, because we don't know. And so we understand with school spirit that we create things that actually reverberates in patterns on and on and on and on and on and on, and we don't know where they go. And basically the assertion of the New Testament is that, well, there are principalities and powers. They're very ancient spirits. Well, do they have consciousness apart from us? Might be. Bible would seem to assume they do. And basically the wisdom of the Bible is act as if they do. Why? Well, because the ancients have learned that that's a pretty important thing. But now, we give our ancients a seat at the table, but our ancients had slaves and, a lot of other things that we don't do anymore. And I think it's a good thing that we don't do them anymore. But the spirit of slavery, see if I say it that way, well, where's the spirit of slavery? Is it in the sweatshop? We'd say, yeah, we still use that word. That's slavery. Is it in that employer who doesn't listen to you and mistreats the employee? Is it in the Me Too movement? Is the spirit of slavery there? Yeah, it's still there. That pattern is still there. But now we're patterns, and we're perpetuating patterns. You go to my last video with my little picture of my son, Ben. We take in these patterns. We take in these spirits, and we perpetuate the spirits, and the spirits live on, and they live above us in the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary. And let's give Peterson his due. Peterson keeps wanting to say, okay, I'm talking scientifically. I'm just talking down here. That's a pretty smart way to do it. As a pastor, I say, well, I'm part of a tradition that says we continue to talk up here. And all of those ways that we have acted with respect to those spirits that we believe are very old and very ancient and continue to impact us today, well, we relate to them in liturgical ways. Now, in my last video, I talked about it's time to stop the outbreak. What do I mean by that? Well, we got this idea, and it was a very smart idea, where if we closed one eye, we could see the world in a different way. And Jordan Peterson talks about this in his transliminal videos. If you take out consciousness or agents or those things, if you close your eye, if you close one eye, you can see the world as Jonathan Peugeot says, in kind of this imaginary thing up here that sees the world objectively and isn't a pattern. And that's a very powerful tool that we used, and we used it in the lab. But it broke out of the lab sort of like a virus and infected the rest of humanity, because we sort of forgot that Newton and many like him were trying to learn about God. Well, what did they mean by God? Well, God was the pattern of patterns, and God was the system of systems. That's God number one. And they're trying to love God. But God was also conscious and personal and all of those things too. And eventually we sort of leave those things behind and we say, well, let's drop the word God and just say that's the universe, because sort of like Eric Weinstein, well, the problem with God is that once you imagine he's conscious and looks and listens, then you have to worry about what he thinks. Yeah. But what if you stop worrying about what he thinks and you're wrong on that? Well, that's Pascal's wager. So the outbreak was a really powerful tool, but it sort of infected everyone, and it itself is a pattern, this way of thinking to do this. Well, that's a pattern. So now we're going to use this pattern writ large. And, well, how big can you actually have it go? Well, that's the question. Because it could be that it's a pattern that is useful for some things, but not for other things. But it itself is a pattern. And that's the key thing here. It itself is a pattern. Secularism is not blue sky. Secularism is another pattern. And it's a pattern that's waning, and it's waning all around the world. It's a very useful pattern. And as it wanes, probably like just about all these other patterns that are built into the system, it won't all go away completely. Its spirit will remain. And its spirit will have aspects that we don't know. Does its spirit have consciousness? Can you relate to it? Can you participate in it? You can't wield it, though. You can't really wield school spirit. You can participate in it. You can be that little repeater of the spirit. You can add your agency to the spirit and tweak and do other things. But the outbreak, which says, well, we can reduce the world by taking out consciousness. No, Peugeot is right. We're patterns looking at patterns, and it's time to remember that. And we're spirits watching spirits, and it's time to remember that too. I actually recorded this and missed a bunch of it and didn't hit record. Anyway, spirits are pattern initiators as well as patterns themselves. School spirit is sort of an initiator, but a very weak one. Does school spirit live on beyond the school? Oh, yes. What is school spirit dependent upon? We're not sure. This really interesting video about quantum fields. We used to think, well, my table is made up of atoms. Okay. It's made up of particles. Okay. And now what happens is that physics is getting weirder and weirder, and my table is made up of fields. What do you mean fields? Well, it's these fields, and the fields make the particles. But you know, this is all indistinguishable to us. Well, we don't know. And so we discover that physics is weirder than we thought, and then we're beginning to discover that we've got patterns inside of us. And I've got the rough draft of partnering from my parents, and I've got the rough draft of parenting from my parents, and I've got the rough draft of citizenship from my country. And I've got all of these rough drafts in there, and some of them are really simple, but some of them are, Peterson keeps using like personalities, and they're like little sub-persons. And so I've got these sub-persons within me. I've got my consciousness congress, and I've got all of these patterns. I have to move my mic a little bit. I'm starting to peak. I've got all these patterns that are going on inside of me. And so is there someone under there that's really acting? And Sam Harris says no, and Bret Weinstein says yes, and I say yes. And well, if that's true inside of me, then how about these other spirits, these other patterns that are up there, and where are they? And again, you have to say you don't know. And how about very old patterns and very enduring patterns? And these are sort of like archetypes, but archetypes aren't really spirits, but they're shaping us, and they possess us, and they inhabit us, and we play them out, and they get perpetuated, and on and on and on and on. And now some of you, again, I did this conversation on, I don't remember, how far are we here? Okay. Objects are patterns in time-space. Fields and waves create particles. Patterns are more fundamental than objects. These are nested patterns. And now you might say, now this object is very important to me, again, in its arena, and it's here on my desk. But there are many, many of these objects via mass production, and they're all over the world. And actually the pattern in other respects is far more consequential. The pattern of plastic water bottle Just one object is nothing, but the pattern of plastic water bottle in terms of how it replicates and goes out into the world, well, that's really fundamental. I have to lower my mic a little bit. That's really fundamental. Why? Because that pattern, as it perpetuates and clings in with other patterns and goes out, well, that gums up the ocean and maybe doesn't get recycled. And now instead of getting water from a tap, I'm getting water from, that's using energy to truck it, and on 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 and on. It's the patterns. It's the objects. And patterns can both take objects into account, but also manage diversity within objects while maintaining metaphor between patterns. And so, metaphorical truth, yeah, but you're just scratching the surface here. And in fact, you're going to really discover that these metaphorical truths are actually colonizing your little other truths. Because the metaphorical truths, well, really, we're talking spirits here. Well, now we're sounding weird. But, the spirit of my father lives on in me. Well, how? In all the other patterns. The spirit of my mother, the spirit of my ancestors, the spirit, and not only the biological patterns that are me, because what is that unborn child? But that's the beginning of a pattern. That if allowed to and what is life but a pattern that's able to colonize other patterns and change. And we have terrible time defining life, but it's fundamentally a pattern, much more than a thing. And that's the point here. That's the transition we're making. That this world of objects where we started out is increasingly a less reliable way to talk about the world. Form for action is better, but spirits. Well, what do you mean by spirits? Well, they're patterns. Well, where do they reside? Well, where isn't probably the first question you should ask. When is bigger than where. And what the patterns are really, that's really the fundamental thing. What are the patterns? Not when, not where, but the patterns, because the spirits get perpetuated. And that's the point that Jordan Peterson was making again and again and again. And these archetypes, because archetypes are patterns, but they're just certain patterns. But I can embody a whole variety of archetypes. I embody an archetype in multiple archetypes. Well, and you may say, well, isn't that the object that is you? No. I'm far more pattern than object. Because I've been making this for 3 years and I've lost hair and, my body has aged in those years and changed. And Jordan Peterson is much more pattern than object. You are much more pattern than object. And spirit, well, spirit is what happens collectively. And spirit is how the collective gets into us and what we manifest and out. And so, yeah, it's time to get beyond the objects. So then what is truth? Well, correspondence of objects, especially in history, is way too low resolution. It's because the objects are subservient to the particles, which are subservient to the fields. And it's the patterns and the spirits that are actually moving. Form for action is more powerful than a world of objects. But the spirits, well, that's really what we're talking about. Oh, Pastor, you're scaring me now. Well, yeah, maybe you should be scared but even from below, which is where Jordan Peterson was trying to point to, that was his point. What is sacrifice? What is that pattern? What is the pattern of sacrifice? We use it for, an altar and a fire and a child or an animal. And so the representation, and actually Bret in those conversations will say, Sam, well, he should have kind of finished it off by saying, yeah, well, what happens in Christianity is that we have the representation of the child sacrifice. And now you're just right into Rene Girard. You have the representation of the sacrifice. So you no longer sacrifice your children. In fact, the tribe that is exhibiting or in some ways manifesting the spirit or pattern of that whole tradition is against the sacrifice of other children. Why? Well, it's built into their system. Well, you didn't really literally mean sacrifice. Well, please tell me what literal means, because the pattern is of far more consequence than the literal stand, if this is what you mean by literal. The pattern of water bottle is far more consequential than a literal water bottle. We should know that by now, because patterns, spirits, inhabit people and they manifest them. Because remember, spirits are patterns. Spirits are pattern initiators as well as patterns themselves, and they go viral. They're mimetic, right? I mean, it's all these words. You start putting these things together, and the Bible doesn't read so strange anymore. And so, metaphorical truth, well, the problem is your other truth is more problematic than the metaphorical kind. The metaphorical kind is that which is colonizing the other kind of truth. And so religion and wisdom are much more about patterns. And that's exactly right. Religion is about the relational patterns more than the static options. We seek and look to participate in enduring patterns. And so then what patterns should we look to the most? Well, the Lindy effect. Again, this is Nassim Taleb. The oldest patterns. Why? The oldest patterns, and this again is from John Buck's little video. It's a good little video. You should watch it. That which has survived a long time, already resistant to changing environments, and shall outlive newer competitors. What is Bret Weinstein and all of his videos in the hopes of doing? He sees a competing pattern that he sees as basically colonizing. He sees a competing spirit and he wants to stop it. And so how is he trying to stop it? By making videos and talking and doing podcasts. That's how he's trying to stop the spirit. Well, maybe where should you look? Probably to older spirits. Well, so if older spirits are more enduring, then you would probably want the oldest spirit. You would probably want not just little spirits in the midst who are sort of running around, but you would probably want the spirit that is both arenic and agentic. Well, where do we find that spirit? Where do we find that spirit? Because, well, the Hebrews were onto something. If your gods like Zeus and Thor are running around in the metadivine realm and are subject to the rules of the metadivine realm, in some ways the metadivine realm, the spirit and patterns of the metadivine realm that to which Thor and Zeus are subject to, well, they're more powerful. So what if in him we live and move and have our being? What if at the creation of the world? What if the patterns are so very old and actually you find life in the patterns? And what if the patterns have, well, already, again, if you go back to this, you find the patterns. Well, it's the abstraction from the patterns. Well, what is the abstraction from the patterns? Well, there are more patterns. And what if, in fact, those more patterns, they live far longer than we do? Well, isn't that sort of immortality? And what if they colonize other people? Well, isn't that sort of power? And what if, in fact, so the Boxing Day tsunami, they have their little story based on the spirit there, and say the spirit moved the waters. Okay. And now you say, well, we have tectonic plates and sensors and all of things. We are more broad. We have more information than them. Well, good. Well, what are you going to do with that information? Well, your God didn't do so well as compared to the little local God with respect to that tsunami, did they? That spirit didn't do as well. Well, what you want is the greater spirit. You want the greatest of all spirits. You want, well, now we're knocking on the door of the ontological argument, aren't we? You say, well, I don't know that there's not a super thing there. Well, I don't know. I know that there's not a super thing there. Oh, do you? You don't know that. You're just skeptical. Well, let's talk about your skepticism. Let's talk about really why you're skeptical about it, because you've been watching the patterns and you think, well, I can't discern a governing pattern beyond it. Okay. But if you're just on that beach and you're not hooked into that one little tribe and their little story of the spirit, and then the tide goes out, well, you march out to get the fish. You're just working an old pattern. You're not hooked into a bigger pattern. Well, you want to be hooked into the biggest of all patterns. Well, good. Join the party. The biggest, the oldest, the abstraction. Where do you start? Well, you're probably going to start by looking at very old things. And you're not just going to want to think about it, because that's just sort of the propositional. You're going to want to participate in it. You're going to want to learn its procedures. You're going to want to relate to it perspectively. Well, how would you do that? Well, you might find yourself relating to it personally. Why? It's one spirit to another. You might find yourself finding other people to find a pattern and relate to it in that pattern. And well, okay, so among some people, you might lose status if you talk to it, so maybe you'll just kind of do it at home quietly in your room. So when you pray, don't go into the temple to pray, but go and do it behind closed doors and ask your Father in heaven in secret. Oh gosh, who said those things? It's just reasonable, people. It's just reasonable if you understand what's going on. So thanks for watching. I did this whole closing a minute ago and wasn't recording. If you're new to the channel, there is an audio-only version of the channel that's on Podbean and also Apple iTunes. You can find the podcast version of it there. If you want to support the channel, subscribe. There's a link to donations to my local church. You can support me that way. There's Patreon. There's, however you want, but yeah, I think bit by bit, I'm slowly starting to make sense of this. So thanks for thinking along with me.